Hey guys, tonight we're climbing into the back of a medieval supply wagon. And trust me, you're going to wish you'd stayed home. Picture this. You're perched on a splintering wooden bench, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fermenting grain, while the whole contraption lurches forward at the blistering speed of a particularly unmotivated tortoise. Your spine compresses with every rut in the road. Mud splashes up through gaps in the floorboards. Somewhere behind you, a wheel is making a sound that suggests it's contemplating retirement. And oh, did I mention? You're heading directly toward a battlefield where thousands of men are about to turn the earth into a churning mess of blood, steel, and screaming. Your job isn't to fight. It's to haul the beans and arrows that'll keep those fighters alive. Spoiler alert, you probably won't make it back. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel while you're drifting off. Someone's falling asleep in Melbourne at 2 a.m., while someone else in Minneapolis is winding down at noon. It's wild. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval supply wagon doesn't get much love in the history books. Chroniclers obsessed over gleaming knights charging into battle, their banners snapping in heroic winds, their swords singing through the air like instruments of divine justice. They waxed poetic about kings rallying troops with speeches that would make Shakespeare weep. But you, the driver or guard sitting on a groaning cart full of salted meat and replacement bowstrings, you're basically a footnote's footnote. If you're lucky, some monk might scribble, "and the supplies arrived," in the margin of a manuscript before moving on to describe a nobleman's fancy new helmet. But here's the thing. Those supplies were everything. Armies moved on their stomachs, as Napoleon would much later observe, and medieval commanders knew it too. A castle could hold out for months if its stores were full. A besieging army could crumble in weeks if the grain shipments stopped. Battles were won not just by who swung the sharpest sword, but by who still had arrows to loose, bread to chew, and ale to dull the misery of camp life. That meant lots of someones actually, had to haul tons of provisions across pre-industrial Europe's abysmal road network. That someone is you. Your wagon is not the romantic covered wagon of Oregon Trail video games. It's not even particularly well made. Most supply wagons were hastily requisitioned from local farmers or merchants, commandeered by feudal lords who promised compensation later. Spoiler, later never came. The vehicle itself is a simple box on 4 wheels, maybe 12 feet long and 4 feet wide, constructed from whatever timber was cheap and available. Oak if you're lucky, pine if you're not. The joints are pegged and nailed, the planks uneven. There's no suspension system beyond the slight give of the wooden axles and whatever mercy the wheel's iron rims might provide, which is to say, none. The wheels themselves are marvels of medieval engineering in the sense that it's marvelous they work at all. They're thick wooden discs or spoked constructions wrapped in metal bands that pick up every pebble, every root, every depression in the road and transmit that information directly into your kidneys. The wagon bed sits maybe 3 feet off the ground, high enough that loading and unloading requires actual effort, low enough that you can't stand upright if there's a canvas cover stretched over hoops. And there usually is a cover, because rain exists and nobody wants 50 pounds of flour turning into paste during a surprise shower. This canvas is crude, often patched, and definitely not waterproof by modern standards. It keeps off the worst of the weather while trapping every foul smell inside like a medieval Dutch oven. Let's talk about what's actually in your wagon, because understanding your cargo helps you understand why people are going to try to kill you for it. The bulk of space is devoted to food, dried peas, beans, oats, and barley, packed in rough burlap sacks that weigh anywhere from 50 to 200 pounds each. These sacks are stacked like the world's least appealing Tetris game, and if they shift during transit, they can crush your foot, tip the wagon, or, if you're spectacularly unlucky, create a grain avalanche that buries you alive. Yes, that happened. Grain storage was genuinely dangerous. You've also got barrels. So many barrels. Small ones called runlets holding 8 to 10 gallons of ale or wine, because medieval armies drank beer the way modern armies drink coffee. Water sources were questionable at best, often contaminated with everything from animal waste to human corpses, depending on where the last battle happened. Beer was safer, the brewing process killed most nasties, and it provided calories. Your barrels might also contain salted fish, brine pork, or pickled vegetables, all swimming in enough salt to mummify a small elephant. The salt keeps things from rotting, but it also makes everything taste like the ocean had a bad day. Soldiers complained constantly. Didn't matter. They ate it anyway. Then there's the equipment. Spare bowstrings bundled by the dozen. Arrows, thousands of them, because archers went through ammunition the way teenagers go through data plans. Crossbow bolts, quarrels they were called, shorter and thicker. Spear shafts, replacement leather straps for armor. Horseshoes and nails. Cooking pots, ladles, axes for chopping firewood. Rope, coils and coils of hemp rope that's rough enough to take the skin off your palms. Canvas for tents. Sometimes even siege equipment components, disassembled mangonels or trebuchet parts that turn your wagon into a slow-moving engineering project. And the weapons. Oh, the weapons. Depending on your lord's paranoia level, you might be hauling crates of swords, maces, and poleaxes meant as replacements for troops who've lost or broken their gear. These aren't fancy knightly weapons. These are mass-produced implements of violence, forged quickly and cheaply, sharp enough to kill but not pretty enough to boast about. They rattle and clank with every bump, a constant metallic percussion section accompanying your journey. Historians still argue whether supply wagons were typically guarded by dedicated soldiers or just drivers with knives. But the consensus leans toward a handful of barely trained men with pointy sticks who'd rather be literally anywhere else. You're probably one of them. Maybe you were a farmer whose lord invited you to serve. Maybe you're a merchant's son pressed into service. Maybe you're a career camp follower who figured driving a wagon beat starving in a ditch. Regardless, you're now responsible for maybe 5,000 pounds of vital supplies, traveling through contested territory, at the speed of a leisurely stroll. The roads, and I'm using that term generously, are nightmares. Roman roads still existed in some places. Their ancient paving stones a reminder that civilization once had its act together, but centuries of neglect had reduced most of them to cracked, overgrown suggestions of thoroughfares. The vast majority of your route follows what we'd politely call tracks. Dirt paths beaten down by centuries of foot traffic, hoofprints, and previous wagons, now churned into either dust bowls or mud swamps depending on recent weather. There's no road maintenance department. There's no department of transportation. There's just the path that everybody uses, and if a tree falls across it, well, I hope you brought an axe. Width is a constant problem. Your wagon needs maybe 8 feet of clearance to pass safely, but paths often narrow to half that, where they thread between old hedgerows or property boundaries that nobody dares move because doing so would trigger a legal feud lasting 3 generations. You're constantly mounting the verge, tilting at alarming angles, scraping against branches that claw at the canvas cover like skeletal fingers. Overhanging limbs are real hazards. More than one driver has been clotheslined right off his bench by a branch he didn't see in time. The wagon's team, usually oxen, sometimes horses, occasionally a mismatched combination that makes the animals as miserable as you, trudges ahead under constant verbal encouragement that ranges from sweet talking to threats that would make a sailor blush. Oxen are preferred for heavy loads because they're stronger than horses, cheaper to feed, and too stupid to panic easily. They're also slower than continental drift and possess the turning radius of a cruise ship. Directing them requires a combination of shouting, stick prodding, and prayer. They respond to your commands with the enthusiasm of teenagers asked to clean their rooms. Your day starts before dawn because armies move early, and supply trains need to move earlier to keep up. You've maybe slept 4 hours, wedged between grain sacks or under the wagon itself, trying to ignore the sounds of several hundred men snoring, coughing, and relieving themselves in the pre-dawn darkness. Breakfast is whatever dried bread you saved from yesterday plus maybe an onion if you're fancy. Then it's hitching the team, a 20-minute process involving heavy wooden yokes, chains, and leather straps that always tangle exactly when you're running late. The convoy master, some minor knight or experienced sergeant, rides down the line making sure everyone's ready, shouting reminders about staying closed up, not wandering off, and not drinking all your personal water ration before noon. He's responsible for maybe 30 to 50 wagons, depending on the army size, and his job is to get all of you from point A to point B without losing more than, say, 20% of the cargo to theft, accident, or enemy action. Those are acceptable losses in medieval logistics. Let that sink in. And then you're moving. The whip cracks, the oxen lean into their yokes, and your wagon lurches forward with all the grace of a drunk rhinoceros. Immediately, the wheel makes that noise again, that grinding, squeaking protest that means something is wrong but not wrong enough to stop and fix because stopping means falling behind, and falling behind means becoming a target. So you keep going, and the noise becomes part of the soundtrack of your life, along with the creaking wood, the sloshing barrels, and the constant low-level swearing of every driver in the column. You're part of something called a baggage train, which sounds vaguely insulting but is actually the technical term. You're the tail that follows the army's head, sometimes by hours, sometimes by days if the terrain is especially terrible. In front of you are other supply wagons. Behind you, more of the same, plus maybe some camp followers, washerwomen, prostitutes, merchants, families of soldiers, trudging alongside on foot because medieval armies were more like mobile towns than modern military units. Everyone's moving in the same direction at roughly the same agonizing pace, kicking up enough dust and dry whether to coat your lungs or enough mud and wet whether to add 10 pounds to your boots. The column stretches. It always stretches. Wagons get separated by slow teams, broken wheels, or drivers who stop to argue about whose turn it is to have the rearmost position. Hint: rearmost is worst because you eat everyone else's dust and are first to get picked off if raiders attack from behind. The convoy master rides up and down, shouting, cajoling, sometimes physically threatening people to close up the gaps. Gaps are dangerous. Gaps mean isolated wagons. Isolated wagons mean dead drivers and looted supplies. You haven't even traveled a mile yet, and your back already hurts. The reality that's sinking in, if it hasn't already, is that you're simultaneously vital and disposable. The army needs what's in your wagon desperately. They need you personally not at all. If you die, they'll appoint another poor soul to take the reins. If your wagon tips and shatters, they'll salvage what they can and keep moving. Medieval warfare was a grinding, pragmatic affair, and sentiment didn't factor into logistics. You were a mobile container, and containers could be replaced. The social hierarchy of a military supply train is fascinatingly grim. At the top, you've got the actual soldiers. Even the lowliest spearman outranks you because he carries a weapon and knows how to use it with at least some proficiency. Then there are the teamsters and wagoners, which is you. Your civilian support staff, pressed or hired, probably unpaid or paid in promises. Below you, basically nobody, except maybe the camp followers who everyone treats as invisible until their services are needed. It's a pecking order enforced by violence and necessity, and your position in it is somewhere between valued servant and acceptable loss. But let's not forget the privilege, and I'm being deeply sarcastic here, of being the person who knows where the food is. In a hungry army, which is to say every army ever, that makes you simultaneously popular and endangered. Soldiers will try to steal from your wagon. Not because they're bad people necessarily, but because they're starving and your cargo smells like salvation. You'll wake in the middle of the night to find someone's knife has opened a sack of grain. And now you've got a slowly hemorrhaging supply that you'll have to explain to your superiors while the culprit vanishes into the dark. Some drivers resorted to sleeping on top of their cargo. Some set traps, crude noisemakers, ropes strung at ankle height to trip midnight raiders. Some just accepted the shrinkage as inevitable and hoped their superiors would too. The medieval supply wagon was a marvel of inefficiency held together by desperation and wood glue. Its maximum daily travel distance on good roads with cooperative weather was maybe 12 to 15 miles. On bad roads or in bad weather, half that. This meant that an army could easily outpace its supplies, which happened constantly, leading to the spectacle of victorious troops starving in enemy territory because their baggage train was stuck 3 days back in a swamp. Coordination was nearly impossible without modern communication. A commander might order supplies forward, but that message had to travel by horseback messenger, who might get lost, ambushed, or distracted by a tavern. By the time you got the order, it might be obsolete, the army having moved on to different positions entirely. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine Empire's superior road network and logistics organization gave them a decisive military advantage over Western European kingdoms. But the evidence is pretty compelling that not having to worry whether your beans would arrive made tactical planning significantly easier. The Byzantines inherited Roman infrastructure and administrative systems that actually tracked supplies, coordinated movements, and penalized incompetence. Western Europe had, well, they had guys like you doing their best with ox-powered technology and hope. Your wagon represents weeks of preparation that you probably weren't involved in. Someone, somewhere, calculated how much food an army of 5,000 men would consume per day. Someone else figured out how many wagons it would take to transport a week's worth of supplies. Someone presumably did math, though medieval math was more educated guessing than the precision science we're used to. The results of these calculations are now your problem, creaking along at 2 miles per hour, heading toward violence you're not equipped to participate in but definitely equipped to die during. One quirky reality that doesn't make it into most history books. Supply wagons were customized by their drivers in small, personal ways. A painted symbol here, a carved talisman there, maybe a particular way of tying the canvas that marked it as yours. This wasn't artistic expression, it was survival. In a camp with 50 identical wagons, you needed to find yours quickly when orders came to move. The alternative was wandering in the dark like an idiot while everyone else rolled out, which was how people got left behind and subsequently murdered. So you'd carve your mark, remember your position in line, and hope that was enough. The existential dread of supply wagon life wasn't just about the destination. It was about the journey itself. Days or weeks of mind-numbing boredom punctuated by moments of stark terror. Walking beside your wagon, or sitting on that bench, or perching on top of the cargo to watch for trouble, your mind had endless time to contemplate all the ways this could go wrong. Will failure, ox death, bridge collapse, bandits, enemy scouts, your own army deciding to requisition supplies without paperwork, which was a polite way of saying legally rob you. Every sound in the forest could be raiders. Every stranger on the road could be a spy reporting your position. Every creek crossing could be the one where everything tips into the water and you lose half your cargo to the current. And yet, people did this. Thousands of people across centuries of medieval warfare did exactly this job. They drove the wagons, hauled the supplies, and somehow kept armies functional despite odds that would make modern logistics officers weep into their spreadsheets. They did it because they had no choice, or because the pay was promised, or because their lord commanded it, or because the alternative was worse. The medieval world didn't offer many options. You could be a peasant tied to the land, a craftsman in a city, a soldier risking your neck, or part of the support structure that made it all function. None of the options were great. Supply wagon driver was at least mobile, even if the mobility was slower than walking and significantly more likely to result in sudden death. The wagon beneath you is more than wood and iron. It's a microcosm of medieval logistics, medieval social structure, and medieval mortality rates all creaking along together. You haven't even encountered the real dangers yet. We'll get to those, but already the mundane realities are crushing. Your body hurts. Your ears ring from the constant noise. Your throat's raw from shouting at oxen who don't care. And you've got somewhere between days and weeks of this ahead of you, assuming you survive. Which, statistically speaking, you probably won't. But we're just getting started. The convoy crawls forward at a pace that would embarrass a geriatric snail. You've been moving for what feels like hours, but is probably 90 minutes, and you've covered maybe 3 miles. 3 miles. You could have walked faster. You could have crawled faster. A determined toddler could have covered more ground. But you're not walking or crawling. You're shackled to several thousand pounds of supplies being pulled by animals who interpret "hurry up" as a personal insult. 2 miles per hour is the average speed of a loaded medieval supply wagon under optimal conditions. Optimal means flat, dry roads with no obstacles, cooperative animals, and the kind of good luck that medieval people prayed for but rarely received. Most days aren't optimal. Most days you're lucky to manage 1.5 miles per hour, and on truly cursed days, steep hills, deep mud, or stubborn oxen staging a work stoppage, you might cover less than a mile in a full day of backbreaking effort. At this speed, traveling the 50 miles from your supply depot to the army's position isn't a day trip. It's a week-long ordeal, maybe 2 weeks, during which literally everything that can go wrong will have ample time to do so. The pace is dictated entirely by your draft animals, and they are not interested in your schedule. Oxen, the usual choice for heavy loads, walk at about 2 miles per hour when they're feeling motivated. That's their maximum sustainable speed. They can't trot like horses. They can't gallop. They plod. It's what they do. Their musculature is built for pulling immense weight over long periods, not for speed. A single ox can pull roughly double its own body weight on a wagon under good conditions. Maybe 1,200 pounds per animal, which is why supply wagons are typically pulled by teams of 4, 6, or even 8 oxen depending on the load and terrain. But here's what medieval logistics manuals, yes, they existed, sort of don't tell you: those oxen need to rest. Frequently, they overheat easily, especially in summer when you're traveling through armored humidity wearing nothing but their own hide. Every few miles you have to stop, let them breathe, maybe offer water if you've passed a stream and have time to let them drink. These stops aren't quick. Oxen don't hurry. They drink with the same leisurely pace they do everything else, like they're savoring a fine wine rather than slurping muddy creek water. Each rest stop can burn 30 minutes to an hour, which devastates your daily mileage and gives you plenty of time to contemplate your life choices. Horses are faster. They can maintain 3 or 4 miles per hour pulling a wagon, but they're expensive, they eat more, and they're skittish. A horse-drawn supply wagon costs roughly 3 times what an ox-drawn one does to operate over a campaign season, which is why most medieval armies saved horses for cavalry and personal transport. If you're stuck with horses, congratulations on your slightly increased speed. Condolences on the fact that your animals will panic at the first sign of danger and potentially wreck everything. There's a reason the phrase stable as an ox exists, but nobody talks about stable horses. The convoy moves as a unit, which means you travel at the speed of the slowest wagon. Always, there's inevitably one teamster whose oxen are older, or whose wagon is more heavily loaded, or who's just spectacularly unlucky with wheel problems. That person sets the pace for everyone. You could theoretically go faster, but the convoy master won't let you because spreading out means vulnerability. Tight formation means mutual protection, or at least the theory of it. So you crawl along behind the wagon ahead of you, watching its rear axle bounce and sway, eating its dust, matching its speed exactly, slowly losing your mind to the monotony. This glacial pace makes you a target in ways that modern people struggle to comprehend. Imagine trying to escape danger when your vehicle's top speed is brisk walk. Enemy scouts on horseback can circle your entire convoy in minutes, counting wagons, assessing defenses, and reporting back to raiding parties before you've traveled a quarter mile. Light cavalry, think mounted skirmishers, not armored knights, can easily outpace you, ride ahead to set up an ambush, grab lunch, take a nap, and still intercept you before you've reached the next village. You're not traveling so much as announcing your presence and giving everyone in the region plenty of time to decide whether robbing you is worth the effort. It usually is. A loaded supply wagon represents portable wealth beyond most medieval people's wildest dreams. That flour you're hauling? A peasant family might spend weeks' wages to buy a sack. The salted pork? Luxury protein they'd taste maybe twice a year. The weapons and equipment? Enough to arm a dozen men. Your wagon is basically a slow-moving treasure chest, and you're the poorly armed security guard everyone can see coming from miles away. The only question isn't whether someone will try to take it, but when and how many someones will try at once. Medieval military commanders understood this vulnerability, which is why supply convoys traveled with escorts when possible. When possible is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Escorts meant diverting actual fighting men from actual fighting to babysit wagons, which commanders hated doing. Every soldier guarding supplies was a soldier not fighting the enemy, and medieval armies were small enough that every sword arm mattered. So escorts tended to be minimal, maybe a dozen soldiers per 20 wagons, often the least effective troops available. These weren't elite guards. They were the guys with lingering injuries, or the ones too old for frontline combat, or the ones whose cowardice in previous battles had earned them safer assignments. Their job wasn't to repel serious attacks. It was to deter opportunistic thieves and maybe slow down raiders long enough for someone important to notice you were being massacred. Historians still argue whether medieval supply convoys suffered higher casualty rates than frontline troops, but the fragmentary evidence suggests it was horrifyingly close. Chronicles mention supply trains being intercepted with the same casual frequency they mention rain. The wagons would be found days later, burned or looted, the drivers nowhere to be seen, or worse, visible as examples of what happens to people who don't surrender fast enough. The psychological warfare of slow travel is real. Every minute you're on the road is a minute you're exposed. Every hilltop could hide observers. Every forest you pass could contain an ambush. Every other traveler you encounter could be a scout, a bandit, or a lost enemy soldier desperate enough to attack even with bad odds. The constant low-level anxiety wears you down faster than the physical labor. Your hand stays near whatever weapon you've been issued, a club, maybe a spear, possibly just a large knife that'll be useless if actual soldiers attack but makes you feel slightly less helpless. You scan the tree-line obsessively. You jerk around at every unexpected sound. And still the wagon creeps forward at its inexorable, infuriating crawl. The road conditions make everything worse. What you're traveling on barely qualifies as a road by any reasonable standard. There's a dirt track, maybe 15 feet wide where it's widest, narrowing to 8 feet or less through settlements or difficult terrain. In summer, it's either choking dust that coats your lungs and turns every breath into a minor sandstorm, or, if it hasn't rained in weeks, hard-packed ruts worn by previous traffic that channel your wheels into grooves they don't want to leave. Your wagon bounces from rut to rut like a very slow, very uncomfortable roller coaster made of splinters and regret. In wet weather, and medieval Europe had plenty of wet weather, the road becomes a different beast entirely. The dirt transforms into mud. Not the cute mud of a modern garden, but deep, sucking, boot-stealing mud that can swallow a wheel to the hub. Your oxen strain against their yokes, their hooves sinking with every step, and forward progress becomes a negotiation with physics that physics is clearly winning. A journey that took 6 hours in dry conditions now takes 2 days because you spend more time stuck than moving. Teams of men have to dismount, dig around the wheels, place boards or branches under them for traction, and then push from behind while the oxen pull from the front and everyone prays nothing breaks. It's exhausting, filthy work, and you do it again and again, sometimes every few hundred yards. Rivers and streams present special nightmares. Bridges exist but not reliably, and the ones that do exist are usually wooden structures of questionable integrity that creak ominously when your multi-ton wagon rolls onto them. You hold your breath crossing every bridge, listening to the timbers groan, watching for signs of structural failure, knowing that if this thing collapses you're losing the wagon, the cargo, possibly the oxen, and definitely any chance of not being executed for incompetence. Some bridges have weight limits enforced by local lords who charge tolls. A few coins if you're lucky, a significant portion of your cargo if you're not. You pay. What choice do you have? Where there are no bridges, there are fords, shallow points where the road simply continues through the water. Fords work great when the water's low and the current's gentle. They work less great when spring snowmelt has turned the peaceful stream into a rushing torrent eager to sweep your wagon downstream like the world's worst boat. You have to judge the depth, the speed, the firmness of the bottom, and whether your oxen will cooperate or panic halfway across. Medieval Europe is littered with the bones of wagons that misjudged these calculations, their remains gradually dissolving in riverbeds, while the crows picked clean the drivers who'd been trapped underneath. One quirky detail that rarely makes the history books. Medieval teamsters developed elaborate rituals and superstitions around river crossings. Some would pray to Saint Christopher, patron saint of travelers. Others would throw coins into the water as offerings to whatever spirits might be listening. Some simply got drunk first, figuring that if they were going to die they might as well not remember it clearly. These weren't ignorant people. They were practical people who understood that they were engaging in an objectively dangerous activity with primitive technology and no safety net. If appealing to higher powers helped them sleep at night, who's to judge? The speed issue compounds exponentially in hostile territory, which is anywhere you're not personally safe, which is everywhere. In friendly lands, your own kingdom's countryside, theoretically protected by your lord's authority, you're merely vulnerable to common bandits, which are a persistent problem throughout the medieval period. Europe was lousy with bandits. Displaced soldiers, landless peasants, younger sons without inheritance, outlaws fleeing justice. All of them saw your wagon train as an opportunity. They didn't need to defeat your entire convoy. They just needed to isolate one wagon, kill or scatter its crew, and vanish with portable valuables before help arrived. Your sluggish pace gave them infinite opportunities to choose their moment. In enemy territory, it's exponentially worse. Now you're facing organized military forces who view your supplies as legitimate targets. Enemy scouts tracked supply convoys religiously because destroying or capturing one could cripple an army's operations. A successful raid on a baggage train might delay an enemy offensive by weeks, buying time for reinforcements or better positioning, which means enemy commanders actively assign troops to hunt convoys like yours. Light cavalry would shadow you for days, waiting for the perfect ambush site. A narrow defile, a dense forest, a river crossing. Somewhere your wagons couldn't maneuver and your minimal escort would be overwhelmed. The tactics were brutally efficient. Riders would hit the front and rear of your column simultaneously, pinning you in place. While your escorts rushed to engage, other raiders would sweep through the middle, cutting draft animals free, setting wagons ablaze and grabbing what they could carry. The whole attack might last 10 minutes. Your survival chances depended entirely on whether you were near the front, middle, or rear when it started, and whether you were smart enough to run immediately rather than trying to fight. Most drivers weren't issued enough weapons to fight effectively anyway. Your job was to deliver cargo, not defend it. If attacked, you were basically encouraged to surrender and hope for mercy. Mercy was not guaranteed. Enemy soldiers might take you prisoner for ransom if you looked valuable, or simply to deprive their enemy of manpower. More often, especially if they were in a hurry, they'd kill you efficiently and move on. Wounded drivers were typically left where they fell. Medieval armies didn't have comprehensive POW protocols, and feeding prisoners meant less food for your own troops. The countryside was full of abandoned supply drivers who'd survived attacks but were too injured to travel, left to die slowly in roadside ditches or crawl toward settlements that might or might not take them in. Even without active attacks, attrition killed convoy members steadily. Accidents were common: men crushed by shifting cargo, run over by their own wagons, kicked by oxen having bad days. Disease spread rapidly in the close quarters. Exhaustion weakened everyone's judgment, leading to stupid mistakes that got people hurt. The cumulative effect over a long campaign was horrific casualty rates that nobody bothered recording because supply drivers didn't matter enough to count. You could start with 50 teamsters and arrive with 30, and as long as most of the wagons made it, the mission was considered successful. Your personal speed of movement is further constrained by the fact that you can't leave the wagon. It's your responsibility, your livelihood if you're a hired teamster, your obligation if you're press service. Abandoning it means execution if you're caught, desertion in the face of the enemy, or theft of military supplies, or whatever charge they felt like inventing. So even when every instinct screams at you to run, to get away from the creaking death trap and the target painted on your back, you stay. You guide your oxen. You maintain formation. You match the convoy's pace, and the convoy's pace is glacial, and you try not to think about how long it'll take to reach safety at this speed. The math is genuinely depressing. 50 miles at 2 miles per hour means 25 hours of travel time, which sounds manageable until you remember that you can only travel maybe 8 to 10 hours per day before oxen need to rest overnight. So 50 miles is actually 3 to 4 days minimum. Add in bad weather, difficult terrain, necessary detours around flooded roads or hostile settlements, and that 50-mile journey easily stretches to a week. A week of exposure. A week of vulnerability. A week of sleeping beside your wagon in hostile country, hoping tonight's not the night raiders decide your stuff is worth the effort. Medieval commanders tried to mitigate this with various strategies. Some sent supply convoys only at night, figuring darkness provided concealment. It did, but it also meant traveling blind on roads you couldn't see, leading to more accidents and slower speeds. Some tried splitting convoys into smaller groups that could move faster and were less conspicuous. That worked until one small group got wiped out and suddenly you'd lost 20% of your supplies in one go. Some commanders simply accepted that logistics were a nightmare and planned around inevitable losses, ordering more supplies than needed with the assumption that half wouldn't arrive. This was expensive and inefficient, but weirdly pragmatic. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, had better systems because they maintained actual road networks and way stations. Byzantine supply convoys could cover 20 to 25 miles per day using relay stations where teams could rest and fresh animals could take over. Western European logistics looked at Byzantine efficiency with the same envy modern drivers feel watching Formula One cars while sitting in traffic. The infrastructure just didn't exist outside the remnants of Roman roads, and even those had deteriorated badly. Western medieval logistics was basically throw wagons at the problem and hope enough arrive. You're living this reality right now, 3 miles into your journey, already exhausted, already sore, already deeply aware that you've got potentially weeks of this ahead. The wagon ahead of you hits a particularly nasty pothole and nearly tips. The driver shouts, the oxen bellow, and for a moment it looks like the whole thing's going over. It doesn't, barely, and the convoy continues without even slowing down. Nobody stops to help. Nobody checks if the driver's okay. The column just absorbs the near disaster and keeps grinding forward because stopping means falling behind, and falling behind means death. Your oxen choose this moment to decide they need to defecate, which they do without slowing down, leaving a steaming trail that the wagon behind you will have to navigate through. The smell is immediate and offensive even by medieval standards, which is saying something. The driver behind you curses your ancestors. You shrug. What are you supposed to do? Ask the oxen politely to hold it? They're animals. They operate on biological imperatives, not courtesy. The sun's climbing now, and despite the early hour, the day's already hot. Your shirt, rough homespun linen that's less clothing and more wearable sandpaper, is soaked with sweat. Your throat's dry. The water skin at your hip is half empty and you're trying to ration it because who knows when you'll pass another stream, and even if you do, you'll have to wait for the convoy master to authorize a stop. And he's in a mood today because apparently the armies moved faster than anticipated and now you're falling behind schedule. Behind a schedule that assumed you'd crawl. You're behind crawling pace. That's how bad this is. 2 miles per hour. The speed of inevitability. The speed of dread. Fast enough to get you to the battlefield eventually, but too slow to avoid anything along the way. You're not traveling to the war. You're giving the war plenty of time to find you first. And it will. The smell hits you first, even before you consciously register what's causing it. It's a thick, organic rot that seems to have texture, coating the inside of your nostrils and settling on your tongue like a living thing. This is your cargo, the precious supplies that thousands of soldiers are depending on, and it's slowly transforming into a biohazard that would make a modern health inspector weep and then immediately condemn the entire operation. Let's start with the grain, because grain is what fills most of your wagon. Sacks and sacks of barley, oats, wheat, and rye, stacked 6 feet high and stretching the length of the cargo bed. In theory, dried grain is stable. In theory, if kept dry and cool, it can last months without significant degradation. But theory lives in a monastery scriptorium where monks carefully record ideal conditions. You live in a wooden box on wheels being dragged through medieval Europe's climate, and ideal conditions are not part of your reality. The grain sacks are burlap, a coarse fabric woven from jute or hemp fibers that's both the best available technology and completely inadequate for the job. Burlap breathes, which is good because it prevents moisture buildup in perfect conditions. It also means that rain gets in, humidity seeps through, and the contents are constantly exposed to temperature fluctuations. Your canvas wagon cover helps, but it's not waterproof, it's water-resistant at best, and after a few good rainstorms, even that resistance fails. Water finds its way in, dripping through seams, pooling on the wagon bed, and soaking into the lower sacks. Wet grain does not remain grain for long. It germinates, sending out pathetic little shoots that turn your food supply into a failed agricultural experiment. Worse, it molds. Medieval people didn't understand microbiology, but they understood that moldy grain made you sick or killed you outright. Ergot fungus, which grows on rye and wheat in damp conditions, causes ergotism, a lovely condition featuring hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and death. They called it St. Anthony's fire because your extremities felt like they were burning as the blood flow to them shut down. Your fingers and toes would literally rot off while you were still alive. Eating ergot-contaminated bread could wipe out entire units. So you check the grain obsessively whenever the convoy stops. You open sacks at random, plunge your arm in up to the shoulder, and feel for heat. Fermenting grain generates warmth as microorganisms throw a party in there. If you feel heat, that sack's compromised. You're supposed to set it aside, report it to the convoy master, and have it destroyed or at least isolated. In practice, you know what'll happen. You'll be blamed for poor storage, possibly punished, and the grain might be used anyway because wasting food in a hungry army is a capital offense. So sometimes you just don't report it. You move the bad sack to the bottom of the pile, hope it doesn't get worse, and pray nobody notices until after you've delivered everything and can disappear. The barrels are their own special nightmare. You're hauling maybe 20 barrels of varying sizes, containing salted meat, pickled fish, ale, and wine. These barrels are supposedly watertight, sealed with pine tar and fitted with wooden bungs, but barrels are made by coopers who are only human, and humans make mistakes. A poorly fitted stave means a slow leak that you won't notice until the entire barrel's drained itself onto your wagon bed. A cracked bung means the contents are exposed to air, and air means spoilage. The salted pork is already borderline inedible when it's fresh, and I'm using fresh ironically because this meat was salted months ago, possibly years ago, packed in enough salt to preserve a farrow. The salt draws moisture out of the meat, creating a brine that's supposed to keep bacteria at bay. It works, mostly, but the pork takes on a gray, desiccated appearance and a texture somewhere between leather and wood. Soldiers rehydrate it in boiling water before eating, which helps, but even then it's tough enough to be mistaken for boot leather and tastes like the ocean's armpit. You've tried it. Once. You stick to bread now when possible. But even preserved pork can go bad if conditions are wrong. If the brine leaks out or evaporates, the meat's exposed. If the barrel wasn't packed properly and there are air pockets, rot can establish itself in those pockets and spread. You've opened barrels to find the top layer of pork covered in a white, fuzzy mold that definitely wasn't there when this barrel was sealed. The smell is indescribable. Rotting meat has an aggressive quality, a stench that seems to attack you rather than simply existing nearby. It makes your eyes water and your stomach clench, and you know you should report it, but again, you're faced with the choice between reporting spoilage and being blamed for it, or staying quiet and hoping someone else discovers it first. The pickled fish are herring, mostly, packed in vinegar and salt brine in smaller runlets that hold maybe 5 gallons each. Herring are cheap protein, widely available in Northern Europe, and soldiers tolerate them because the alternative is starving. The pickling process is effective preservation. The acidity and salt create an environment where most bacteria can't survive. But the brine has to stay at the right concentration, and that means the barrel has to stay sealed. Every bump in the road, every jostle and crash as your wagon lurches over ruts, tests those seals. You hear sloshing from the fish barrels and wonder if that's normal liquid movement or a sign that a seal's failed and you're slowly leaking expensive brine onto the wagon bed. One particularly gruesome detail that chronicles mention but don't elaborate on: barrels sometimes contain not just food but also parts of food that modern people would consider food waste. Salted pork barrels might include organs, intestines, even heads. Anything with meat on it got preserved because wasting protein was unconscionable when you were feeding thousands. Opening a barrel and finding yourself face to face with a pig's head, its eyes clouded and white from salt, its mouth open in a permanent scream, is the kind of experience that sticks with you. You get used to it. You have to. This is food, even if it looks like a horror show. The ale barrels are their own category of concern. Medieval ale is not modern beer. It's a low-alcohol grain beverage, usually around 2 to 4% alcohol by volume, consumed daily because water safety was questionable at best. It's brewed quickly and drunk quickly because it doesn't keep long. The hops we associate with modern beer are barely used in this period. Instead, brewers used various herbs, a mixture called grut, to flavor and help preserve the ale. But preservation is relative. Ale starts deteriorating within days of brewing, developing off flavors, souring, or simply going flat. Your ale barrels were probably filled a week or two ago at best, meaning they're already past their prime. Each day of travel is another day of degradation. The ale is going sour, developing vinegary notes that make it less palatable but don't necessarily make it unsafe. Soldiers will drink it anyway. Sour ale beats no ale, but they'll complain, and their complaints will somehow become your fault. If a barrel seal fails and the ale spills, you've lost not just the beverage but also the calories it represented. A barrel of ale contains maybe 1,000 calories per gallon, and 10 gallons is 10,000 calories gone, enough to feed a dozen men for a day. Wine, reserved for officers and noblemen, travels in its own barrels and is theoretically more stable due to higher alcohol content. But wine can also spoil, turning to vinegar if exposed to too much air or the wrong bacteria. You've got maybe 4 wine barrels in your wagon, and you guard these with special paranoia because officers who don't get their wine ration become truly unpleasant people to be around. Spoiled wine means angry nobles, and angry nobles mean finding a scapegoat, and you're dressed in scapegoat clothes. Then there's the produce, such as it is. You might have a few sacks of root vegetables. Onions, turnips, maybe some carrots if the army's wealthy enough. These are hardy vegetables chosen specifically because they last longer than fresh greens, but even they have limits. Onions rot from the inside out, looking fine externally until you pick one up and it collapses into a putrid mush in your hand. Turnips develop soft spots that spread like cancer through storage sacks. The smell of rotting onions is particularly offensive. A sweet, sulfurous reek that clings to everything and makes you gag even hours after you've thrown the bad ones out. Cheese, if you're lucky enough to haul any, is hard cheese designed to travel wheels of aged, dried cheese that could double as building materials. These last reasonably well, but they attract vermin like nothing else. Mice, rats, and insects all want a piece of your cheese supply, and they're persistent little bastards who can chew through burlap, wood, and sometimes even thin metal to get at it. You find evidence of their raids constantly. Tiny tooth marks, droppings, and the maddening knowledge that your cargo is being consumed by unauthorized mouths even as you transport it. Historians still argue whether medieval armies lost more supplies to spoilage or to enemy action, but the fragmentary records suggest spoilage was the bigger problem by a significant margin. A well-executed enemy raid might destroy 10% of a convoy. Normal spoilage over a 2-week journey could easily consume 20 to 30% of perishable goods. The math was brutal. You loaded more than you needed because you knew you'd deliver less than you loaded. The biological warfare happening in your wagon is relentless. Bacteria, mold, fungi, insects, and rodents are all waging campaigns against your cargo, and they've got better success rates than most medieval generals. Every day of travel is another day of attrition, another percentage point of supplies lost to the inexorable forces of decomposition. You can slow it but not stop it. The best you can hope for is delivering enough usable supplies to avoid execution. Living in close proximity to this rolling disaster makes you intimate with smells that would hospitalize modern people. The baseline aroma is a complex bouquet of grain dust, stale sweat, animal musk from the oxen, and the earthy scent of burlap. Layer onto that the sour tang of fermenting ale, the salt-sharp smell of preserved meat, the aggressive funk of cheese, and the occasional gut punch of something actively rotting. On hot days, the whole wagon becomes a greenhouse of competing stenches, each one trying to dominate your nostrils. You adapt. Humans are astonishingly good at sensory adaptation, but the adaptation comes at a psychological cost. You start to carry the smell with you. It soaks into your clothes, your hair, your skin. You smell like your cargo, and your cargo smells like barely controlled decay. The hygiene implications are staggering even by medieval standards, which weren't exactly high to begin with. You're eating food that's been stored next to rotting food. Your drinking water shares space with barrels of questionable contents. The utensils you use to check supplies, your hands mostly, go from contaminated grain to your mouth without much in the way of washing because water's for drinking, not cleaning. Medieval people didn't understand germ theory, but they understood that sick people died, and people around sick people got sick. You watch yourself and your fellow teamsters for signs of illness the way sailors watched for scurvy. Dysentery is the big fear, and we'll get into that more later, but spoiled food is its primary vector. One bad meal from contaminated supplies, and you're spending the next week expelling fluids from both ends while trying to maintain your position in a moving convoy. Dehydration follows quickly, especially in summer heat, and dehydration kills. You've already seen 2 teamsters die from what started as a bit of a stomach problem and escalated to fatal dehydration within 72 hours. Their bodies were buried in shallow roadside graves, unmarked and unmourned, because the convoy couldn't stop long enough for proper funerals. Food poisoning from spoiled meat presents differently: violent vomiting, cramping, fever. Salmonella and E. coli don't care that you're in the Middle Ages. They've been poisoning humans since humans started eating things. The salted and pickled preservation helps, but it's not foolproof, especially if the initial salting was inadequate or the container seal failed. You've had food poisoning twice on this campaign already, once from sketchy pork, once from ale that had gone truly vile. Both times you kept working because stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind meant abandoning your wagon, and abandoning your wagon meant execution. So you worked through it, pausing occasionally to vomit over the side of your moving wagon, then climbed back onto the bench and continued guiding your oxen while your insides rebelled. One quirky survival strategy that Teamsters developed, the sniff test, elevated to an art form. You learned to identify spoilage by smell long before it became visible. Fresh grain has a clean, neutral smell. Grain that's starting to mold smells musty, like a damp cellar. Grain that's actively fermenting smells sweet and alcoholic. Each stage told you how much time you had before that sack became a total loss. Meat was easier. Bad meat announces itself aggressively. But fish could be tricky, since even properly preserved herring smells pretty intense. You learned the difference between strong but safe and actively dangerous, and that knowledge kept you and others alive. The weight of your cargo is constantly changing, not just from spoilage but from theft and evaporation. Barrels lose liquid to seepage and evaporation through the wood. A barrel of ale might lose a gallon or more over a week-long journey just from environmental factors. This changes the wagon's weight distribution, which affects how it handles. A wagon that balanced perfectly when fully loaded starts to feel off as the right side loses weight faster than the left, making turns tricky and increasing the chance of tipping. You compensate constantly, shifting barrels, rearranging sacks, trying to maintain balance even as the contents deteriorate unevenly. The economic loss represented by spoilage was staggering. A supply convoy might represent weeks of tax revenue, requisitioned goods, and purchased supplies, essentially the concentrated wealth of entire regions packed into wagons. Losing 30% to spoilage meant 30% of that investment simply vanished, turned into sewage and compost. Medieval accountants, yes, they existed, tried to track these losses, but their ledgers reflect a constant battle between what was loaded and what was delivered. The shortfalls were blamed on various factors: weather, poor containers, incompetent teamsters, divine displeasure, witchcraft. Rarely did they blame the fundamental problem. They were trying to transport organic materials across long distances using primitive technology in pre-refrigeration conditions. You're living inside this failure right now, surrounded by supplies that are simultaneously precious and decaying, essential and disgusting. The contradiction defines your existence. You're protecting treasure that's rotting. You're risking your life for cargo that might be inedible by the time it arrives. The absurdity would be funny if the consequences weren't lethal. The sun's higher now, and the heat inside the canvas-covered wagon is approaching oven-like intensity. The smells intensify with temperature. Biochemistry loves heat. You've long since stopped noticing most of it, your nose having surrendered to sensory overload, but occasionally a particularly offensive waft breaks through your adaptation and reminds you that you're basically living in a slow-motion composting operation. A barrel shifts slightly as you hit a bump, and you hear liquid slosh in a way that doesn't sound quite right. Something's leaking. You'll have to check it at the next stop, assuming there is a next stop, assuming the convoy master isn't in one of his moods where he decides that stopping is weakness and drives everyone until someone collapses. Welcome to medieval logistics, where everything you're protecting is dying, and you're probably dying with it, but at least you're dying slowly enough to deliver some percentage of usable supplies before expiring. It's not the glory they promise when they recruit supply drivers, but it's the truth they deliver. Your life is controlled by approximately 4,000 pounds of muscle, bone, and obstinacy split between 4 oxen who have opinions about everything and express those opinions through strategic non-cooperation. These animals are simultaneously your transportation, your responsibility, and your greatest source of existential dread. Without them, your wagon doesn't move. With them, your wagon moves according to their schedule, their comfort level, and their mysterious internal decision-making process that seems designed specifically to maximize your suffering. Let's start with what oxen actually are, because medieval people didn't have breeds in the modern sense. They had whatever cattle we can castrate and train to pull things. Most draft oxen are castrated bulls, usually neutered around age 2, then trained over the following year to accept the yoke and respond to commands. The castration is crucial. Intact bulls are aggressive, unpredictable, and more interested in fighting or breeding than pulling your wagon. Castration mellows them, redirects their energy toward work, and makes them marginally more manageable. Marginally. Your team of 4 oxen represents a significant investment. A trained draft ox in the 14th century might cost 10 to 15 shillings, roughly equivalent to a skilled craftsman's monthly wages. 4 oxen plus yokes, chains, and harness equipment could easily represent more value than the wagon itself. This means you're responsible for protecting not just supplies but also expensive livestock that your lord or the army quartermaster will absolutely murder you over if you lose them. No pressure. They're big animals. A mature ox stands maybe 5 feet at the shoulder and weighs 12 to 1,500 pounds. When one decides to move in a particular direction, you don't stop it, you get out of the way or get trampled. They're stronger than horses, capable of pulling roughly twice their body weight under good conditions, which is why they're preferred for heavy wagons. But strength comes with stubbornness. Oxen are not naturally obedient. They're working because they've been trained to work, and that training is always in negotiation with their desire to do literally anything else. The yoke system is ancient technology, basically a heavy wooden beam that rests across the necks of 2 oxen, secured with leather straps and wooden pins. Your 4 oxen are yoked in 2 pairs, one pair ahead of the other in what's called a tandem hitch. The front pair is your lead team, theoretically your smartest and best trained animals. The rear pair provides additional power for heavy loads or difficult terrain. The yoke distributes the pulling force across their shoulders and necks, transferring it through chains to the wagon's tongue, the long wooden beam extending from the front axle. In theory, this system is efficient. In practice, it's a constant source of problems. The yoke has to fit properly or it rubs raw spots into their necks, causing open sores that become infected and turn your ox into a useless, suffering creature. The leather straps stretch and crack, requiring constant adjustment and replacement. The chains develop weak links that fail at inopportune moments, usually while you're climbing a hill, sending your wagon rolling backward while your oxen bolt forward, newly freed and delighted to no longer be pulling anything. Controlling 4 oxen requires a specialized vocabulary of commands that varies by region but generally includes about a dozen words or phrases they're supposed to recognize. G means turn right. Ha means turn left. Get up or hike means start moving or move faster. Whoa means stop. Back means reverse, which oxen hate and only do under extreme duress. You shout these commands constantly, along with creative profanity and personal insults that the oxen ignore with magnificent disdain. The goad, your primary tool of persuasion, is a wooden stick about 6 feet long, sometimes tipped with a metal point, used to encourage oxen who've decided that standing still is their new career. You don't actually stab them with it, or you're not supposed to anyway, but you prod them firmly in the hindquarters or flanks to suggest that forward motion is in their best interest. Some teamsters carry whips instead, cracking them near the oxen's ears for auditory motivation. Neither tool is particularly effective when an ox has truly committed to being difficult. Because here's the fundamental problem. Oxen are prey animals with prey animal brains. They're constantly evaluating their environment for threats, and their threat assessment is completely divorced from human logic. A fluttering leaf might be a predator. That shadow could be dangerous. The path ahead looks suspicious. Their response to perceived threats is either freeze or panic, and both responses are terrible when you're trying to maintain convoy speed on a narrow road. One ox spooking can cascade into all four panicking, and for panicking oxen attached to a multi-ton wagon create carnage in seconds. They might bolt forward, running despite the weight they're pulling, dragging your wagon over terrain it was never meant to cross. They might try to turn around, tangling the chains, flipping the wagon, or simply creating a confused pile of animals, wood, and cargo in the middle of the road. They might rear up, breaking the yoke, which then swings around and cracks you in the skull hard enough to kill you. You've seen all of these scenarios play out in your convoy. They're not hypothetical dangers, they're inevitable occurrences you're waiting to experience personally. Feeding oxen on the move is a logistical nightmare within your larger logistical nightmare. Each ox needs roughly 20 to 30 pounds of hay or grass per day, plus water, lots of water, gallons of it. That's 80 to 120 pounds of fodder daily for your 4-ox team. Over a week-long journey, you're talking about half a ton of animal feed, which obviously isn't being hauled in your wagon because that space is reserved for human supplies. Instead, your oxen have to graze opportunistically whenever the convoy stops, and hope they can consume enough to maintain their strength. This creates perverse incentives around rest stops. You need to stop frequently enough for your oxen to eat, but the convoy master wants to minimize stops to maintain progress. The compromise is usually inadequate for the animals. They get an hour here, 2 hours there, not nearly enough time to consume their full caloric needs. Over days and weeks, your oxen get thinner. Their ribs start showing. Their strength diminishes. Their ability to pull your heavy wagon degrades, which slows the convoy further, which means longer campaigns, which means more inadequate feeding. It's a death spiral, and you're watching it happen in real time. Water is even more critical. An ox can drink 10 to 15 gallons per day in hot weather, and they need access to clean water sources. This means every stream crossing, every river ford, becomes a feeding opportunity you have to exploit. You unhitch them partially. Let them drink their fill while maintaining enough control that they don't simply wander off to explore the tasty-looking grass they've spotted. This process takes time. Oxen are leisurely drinkers who see no reason to hurry, and time is something the convoy master insists you don't have. So you rush them, which stresses them, which makes them difficult, which costs more time. It's a magnificent cycle of inefficiency. Historians still argue whether medieval armies' reliance on oxen versus horses gave them strategic advantages or disadvantages. But the consensus leans toward oxen were necessary evils that everyone hated but couldn't replace. Horses were faster and more responsive but cost 3 times as much to maintain and panicked more easily. Oxen were cheaper, stronger for their size, and calmer under normal circumstances. The problem was that campaigns rarely involved normal circumstances. One particularly nasty reality about working oxen: their hooves require maintenance, and they wear shoes just like horses, except ox shoes are more complicated because oxen have cloven hooves. Each foot is essentially 2 separate toes. Ox shoes are 2 separate iron plates per hoof, meaning 8 pieces of metal per animal, 32 shoes total for your 4-ox team. These shoes wear down on rough roads, crack, fall off, and need replacement. A shoeless ox on rocky terrain goes lame quickly, developing painful hoof problems that make it worthless as a draft animal. You don't carry a full set of replacement shoes, there's not enough room, so when an ox loses a shoe, you're dependent on finding a farrier at the next settlement, assuming there is a next settlement, assuming they have ox shoes in the right size, assuming you have money to pay them. Often you don't, and you're forced to continue with a progressively lamer ox who's pulling less and less of its share, putting more strain on the other three, who then tire faster, and suddenly your whole team is degrading because one piece of iron fell off at the wrong moment. The oxen also get sick because of course they do. They develop respiratory infections from exposure to cold, wet conditions. They get digestive problems from eating unfamiliar forage or moldy hay. They develop hoof rot from standing in mud. They get parasites from contaminated water. Medieval veterinary medicine for livestock consisted mostly of wait and see if it dies, with occasional interventions involving herbs, prayers, or cutting-edge treatments like bleeding the animal, which definitely made things worse but made humans feel like they were doing something. When an ox dies mid-campaign, you're faced with several terrible options. You can try to continue with 3 oxen, which means less pulling power and slower speeds. You can try to find a replacement ox, which means stopping, searching nearby settlements, negotiating prices you probably can't afford, and hoping the replacement animal is trained enough to work in your team. Or you can abandon the wagon, transfer critical supplies to other wagons that are already overloaded, and pray the convoy master doesn't execute you for losing valuable equipment. None of these options are good. The emotional relationship you develop with your oxen is complicated. They're not pets, they're tools, equipment, livestock. But you spend 12 hours a day with them every day for weeks or months. You learn their personalities. The left lead ox, you've named him Stupid because he always tries to veer left toward anything green, convinced that whatever grass he hasn't eaten yet must be superior to the grass he just ate. The right lead ox, Bastard, has a habit of stopping abruptly whenever he hears unexpected sounds, causing the oxen behind him to run into him, creating a pile-up of confused bovines. The rear pair, slow and slower, are older animals who've clearly given up on life but continue pulling through sheer momentum and habit. You curse these animals constantly. You threaten them with vivid descriptions of what you'll do when they become meat. You promise them fantastic futures as leather goods. And then you find yourself rationing your own food to share with them because they look hungry, or spending your rest time picking stones out of their hooves because you know it hurts them, or sleeping next to them at night because their body heat is warm and you're cold and somehow their breathing is comforting even though they smell like everything that's wrong with medieval agriculture. One quirky historical detail. Teamsters developed superstitions about ox behavior as weather prediction. If your oxen were restless before dawn, rain was coming. If they refused to drink at a stream, the water was bad. If they all lay down at the same time during a rest stop, you were about to get attacked, or so the superstition claimed. Whether any of this was accurate is debatable, but when you're living in a world without weather forecasts or water testing, you grasp at any pattern that might give you an edge. The sound of ox distress is something you learn to recognize and dread. They're normally quiet animals, they don't moo like dairy cows. They grunt softly when pulling hard, breathe heavily when tired, and make a low, rumbling sound when content. But when they're in pain or terrified, they bellow, a deep, resonant sound that vibrates through your chest and tells everyone within earshot that something has gone very wrong. You've heard that sound when an ox broke its leg in a hole and had to be slaughtered. You've heard it when bandits hamstrung the lead team of a wagon to stop it, crippling the animals for no reason except efficiency. You've heard it in your nightmares. The butchering process, when an ox does die or has to be destroyed, is practiced and pragmatic. Nothing goes to waste. The meat gets distributed, finally, some fresh protein instead of salt pork, though draft oxen are tough and stringy compared to beef cattle. The hide becomes leather. The bones get boiled for soup or carved into tools. The hooves and horns get rendered for glue. The intestines become rope or sausage casings. Even the tail is saved. Oxtail actually makes decent soup. You participate in this butchering because everyone does, and you're surprised to discover you feel sad about it, which is ridiculous because you hated this ox, you've been cursing it for weeks, but also it pulled your wagon and now it's dead and somehow that matters. Your oxen determine not just how fast you travel, but whether you travel at all. If they refuse to move, and sometimes they do, planted like furry boulders, completely unresponsive to goads, whips, or shouted threats. You're stuck. You can't pull the wagon yourself. You can't magic new oxen into existence. You can try switching them around, putting fresh animals at the front, hoping that changes their attitude. You can try feeding them treats, a handful of grain, an apple if you've got one, bribing them into cooperation. Sometimes it works. Sometimes they just stand there, and you stand there, and the convoy leaves you behind, and you contemplate the very real possibility that you and your wagon full of rotting supplies will simply become a permanent fixture of this particular stretch of road. For 1,000 pounds of living, breathing, defecating, opinionated animals stand between you and your destination. They're stronger than you, dumber than you in some ways and smarter in others, and completely indifferent to your problems, your fears, or your desperate need to deliver these supplies before everyone dies. They'll work as long as they feel like working, which is never quite long enough, and they'll stop whenever they decide to stop, which is always too soon. You're not driving the wagon so much as negotiating with 4 large animals who hold all the actual power. They're just kind enough to usually pretend you're in charge. Until they're not. The arrow comes from nowhere, which is how arrows always come. One moment you're trudging alongside your wagon, half asleep despite the noon sun, contemplating nothing more threatening than whether you'll find drinkable water at the next stop. The next moment there's a wet thud, a surprised grunt, and the teamster 2 wagons ahead of you is on his knees with a shaft protruding from his shoulder at an angle that makes your stomach clench. He doesn't even scream, just stares at the arrow like it's a personal betrayal, which in a way it is. Everything happens very fast after that, and also very slowly because time does weird things when violence arrives. Someone shouts, you're never sure who shouted first, whether it was a sentry or the wounded man or just someone with faster reflexes than you. The convoy master is suddenly there, sword drawn, bellowing orders that get lost in the chaos. Oxen are lowing, confused, and picking up on human panic. Drivers are scrambling for weapons they probably don't have. And somewhere in the tree line to your right, you know with absolute certainty that more arrows are coming, and men with those arrows, and your slow, lumbering, completely indefensible wagon train has just become a feast for whoever's out there. Welcome to being raided. It's going to be the longest 10 minutes of your life. Medieval supply convoys were target-rich environments in an age of endemic violence and starvation. You're hauling food, equipment, and weapons through countryside that's perpetually on the edge of famine, populated by displaced soldiers, desperate peasants, organized bandits, and enemy military units who all view your wagon as a mobile grocery store that's insufficiently guarded. The surprise isn't that convoys got raided. It's that any supplies made it through at all. The threat spectrum is diverse. At the bottom, you've got opportunistic thieves, local peasants or outlaws who spot your convoy, count your guards, do some quick math, and decide the risk is worth the reward. These aren't professional fighters. They're hungry people with improvised weapons, desperate enough to attack but not organized enough to be truly effective. They'll go for isolated wagons, stragglers, or attack at night when visibility is poor. They're dangerous because desperation makes people unpredictable, but they usually flee if they meet serious resistance. Mid-tier threats are organized bandit groups. These are men who've made robbery their profession. Former soldiers, younger sons without inheritance, criminals fleeing justice, all banded together under a leader who's figured out that stealing is more profitable than starving. They have actual weapons, some tactical sense, and the coordination to execute ambushes. They'll scout your convoy for days, learning your routine, counting your guards, identifying weaknesses. Then they strike at river crossings, narrow defile, or anywhere your wagons are strung out and vulnerable. Their goal is usually plunder without excessive risk. They want your supplies, but they're not interested in dying for them. Top-tier threats are military raids, enemy light cavalry or infantry specifically tasked with disrupting your supply lines. These are professional soldiers following orders, equipped with real weapons and armor, trained in small unit tactics. They don't just want your supplies. They want to cripple your army's logistics. Their attacks are vicious, efficient, and often leave no survivors because prisoners slow them down. When you see actual soldiers attacking, your survival chances drop precipitously because they're not robbing you. They're executing a military operation in which you're an acceptable casualty. The tactics vary but follow predictable patterns. The classic ambush happens at a choke point, a narrow bridge, a forest trail, a hillside pass where your convoy has to string out single file. Attackers position themselves on both sides, wait until your wagons are committed to the difficult terrain, then hit the front and rear simultaneously. The front attack stops the lead wagons, blocking the path. The rear attack prevents retreat. Everything in the middle is trapped, and that's when the real violence starts. Raiders on horseback are particularly terrifying because speed is their advantage and your disadvantage. They can circle your entire convoy in minutes, probing for weaknesses, shooting arrows into drivers and guards, creating chaos that prevents organized defense. Light cavalry aren't trying to charge through your wagons. They're harassing you, killing your people and animals, forcing you to stop and form a defense while other raiders dismount and go through your cargo at leisure. You can't outrun horsemen. You can't fight them effectively from a stopped wagon. You can only endure and hope your escorts are competent. Nighttime raids are psychologically devastating because you can't see what's happening. You're camped beside your wagon, maybe sleeping under it, definitely exhausted from the day's travel. The first you know of the attack is shouting, the sound of metal on metal, maybe screams. You wake disoriented, groping for whatever weapon you've got. A club, a knife, a tent peg if you're desperate. Shadows are moving everywhere. Fires are being kicked over, plunging the camp into darkness. You can't tell friend from enemy. Someone runs past you and you swing at them reflexively, and you'll never know if you hit a raider or your fellow teamster. Your escorts, those dozen or so soldiers assigned to protect the convoy, are usually undermanned and overwhelmed. They're not elite troops. They're whoever the commander could spare, often older men or the walking wounded given light duty that turns out to be lethal. Against a determined attack by superior numbers, they can slow the raiders but rarely stop them. Their tactical doctrine is basically form up, look intimidating, and hope the bandits decide easier targets exist elsewhere. When that fails, it devolves into scattered melees where individual skill and luck determine who lives. The reality of medieval combat is that it's nothing like the movies. There's no choreography, no honor, no dramatic music. It's frantic, ugly, and over quickly. Someone swings a sword at you and you either block it or you don't. Someone tackles you from behind and you're on the ground with a knee on your spine and a knife approaching your throat. You stab wildly at anyone who gets close, not aiming, not thinking, just trying to hurt them before they hurt you. The sounds are wrong. Real violence is mostly grunting, gasping, the wet noises of metal entering flesh. People don't deliver witty one-liners. They curse, cry, beg, or make no sound at all because they're too focused on not dying. Historians still argue whether supply convoy guards were expected to fight to the death or were tacitly allowed to flee if overwhelmed, but the practical answer is that most fled when possible. You're not being paid enough to die for someone else's grain. If the situation's clearly lost, your escorts are down, raiders are everywhere, resistance means certain death, you run. Drop everything and run into the forest, into the fields, anywhere that isn't here. Some teamsters survive this way, hiding until the raiders leave, then emerging to find their wagon looted or burned and their fellow drivers dead or missing. The looting itself is efficient and brutal. Raiders know exactly what they want: food first, weapons second, anything portable third. They'll cut grain sacks open and transfer contents to bags they brought. They'll roll barrels off wagons and load them onto horses or their own carts if they brought them. They'll grab bundles of arrows, spare weapons, cooking equipment, rope, anything useful. What they can't carry, they often destroy to deny it to your army. Barrels get smashed. Wagons get set on fire. Oxen get hamstrung or killed, removing your ability to move even if you somehow survive. The personal violence is casual and horrific. Raiders who encounter resistance don't negotiate. They kill quickly and move on. A sword through the chest, an axe to the skull, a spear in the back. Medieval weapons are effective at creating lethal trauma, and medical care is non-existent. So even minor wounds often prove fatal through blood loss or infection. You've seen men killed over a sack of oats, their lives valued at less than 50 pounds of grain, and the raiders didn't even slow down afterward, just stepped over the body and continued loading supplies. Surrender is an option but not a guarantee of survival. Some raiders take prisoners for ransom if you look valuable. Your clothes suggest you're someone's servant. Maybe your lord will pay for your return. More often, especially with military raids, prisoners are a liability. You'll be tied up, questioned briefly about the army's position and strength, then killed if you're lucky or maimed and left to die slowly if you're not. Bandits sometimes press gang captured teamsters into service. Congratulations, you now work for the people who just murdered your colleagues, and you'll do it because the alternative is immediate death. One particularly grim detail that chronicles mention obliquely: raiders sometimes left survivors intentionally mutilated as messages. A teamster would be found alive but missing hands, or blinded, or with hamstrung legs. The cruelty served multiple purposes. It sent a message to other convoys that resistance was futile. It created living warnings that consumed resources and lowered morale. And it satisfied whatever sadistic impulses men develop when violence becomes routine and human life becomes cheap. The aftermath of a successful raid on your convoy is apocalyptic in its small, personal way. Wagons are overturned or burning. Bodies are scattered. Drivers, guards, animals, all mixed together in death's egalitarian arrangement. The wounded are crying for help that isn't coming. Supplies are everywhere, trampled into mud or carried off. Weeks of logistical preparation destroyed in minutes. Survivors are in shock, standing around looking lost, or they're frantically trying to salvage something from the disaster before secondary raiders arrive to pick over what the first wave left behind. If you survived, you're now faced with impossible decisions. Do you try to save the wounded? Do you attempt to recover scattered supplies? Do you salvage your wagon if it's still intact? Do you gather surviving oxen and try to continue? Or do you simply run, abandoning everything, hoping to reach friendly territory before you die of exposure or get caught by follow-up raiders? There's no right answer, and the wrong answer kills you, so you make a choice and live with it if you live at all. The psychological impact of being raided doesn't fade. Every forest becomes a threat. Every hilltop could hide observers. Every stranger is potentially hostile. You develop a constant low-level paranoia that's not paranoia because the threats are real and persistent. You sleep badly, jerking awake at every sound. You imagine attacks constantly, planning responses to scenarios that might never happen but could happen at any moment. Your fellow teamsters are the same. Everyone's wound tight, jumping at shadows, short-tempered from stress and fear. Some convoys experience multiple raids over a single journey. The first raid takes half your supplies. The second takes most of what's left. By the third, you're escorting empty or near-empty wagons because there's nothing left to steal, but you continue because orders are orders and abandoning your post is execution. You arrive at your destination with minimal supplies and maximum trauma, and the army commanders are angry that you didn't bring more, as if you could have fought off determined raiders with a club and optimism. The economic calculation of raiding was brutally simple. A successful attack on a supply convoy could yield food, weapons, and equipment worth months or years of peasant labor, acquired in minutes with relatively low risk if you chose your target well. The reward-to-risk ratio was extraordinarily favorable from the raider's perspective. From your perspective as a teamster, it meant you were a walking prize in a world full of contestants who'd kill you for the entry fee. One quirky survival strategy that some convoys adopted: traveling with nothing valuable and letting everyone know it. Empty wagons or wagons full of rocks, moving as decoys while the real supplies traveled by different routes. This worked occasionally, but raiders learned to be suspicious, checking cargoes before committing to attacks, which led to its own set of dangers. Do you reveal you're a decoy and hope they leave you alone? Or pretend you're protecting real supplies and hope they don't call your bluff? The sound of horses approaching from behind became the most terrifying sound in your life. It might be messengers or your own cavalry or supply wagons catching up. Or it might be raiders who've been shadowing you, waiting for the right moment. You learn to recognize the difference. Friendly horses usually announced themselves, called out greetings, maintained steady paces. Hostile horses came fast or sneaky, their riders silent, the rhythm wrong. By the time you were sure they were hostile, they were usually already in range to kill you. Defense was nearly impossible at convoy speeds. You couldn't form shield walls while moving. You couldn't establish defensive positions. Your fortification was a wooden wagon that arrows punched through and fire consumed eagerly. The best defense was not being attacked in the first place. Traveling in large groups, paying for larger escorts, choosing safer routes even if they took longer, moving only during daylight, camping in defensible positions. All of these measures reduced risk but never eliminated it because medieval Europe was fundamentally violent and your convoy was fundamentally vulnerable. The raiders you feared most weren't the desperate peasants or even the organized bandits. They were the hungry ones, people who'd reached the point where death by violence was preferable to death by starvation. Starving people attacked with suicidal determination because they had nothing to lose. They'd charge armed guards barehanded if necessary, accepting horrific casualties, overwhelming through sheer numbers and desperation. You couldn't reason with starvation. You couldn't intimidate it. You could only kill enough starving people that the survivors retreated, and if you had enough humanity left to feel bad about it afterward, well, that was your problem to carry. The arrow that started this section, remember that? The teamster 2 wagons up is still on his knees, though someone's gotten to him now, trying to break off the arrow shaft without pushing it deeper. He's going to die, probably either from the wound itself or the infection that'll follow. But right now, in this moment, the attack is somehow over. The raiders, whoever they were, have vanished back into the forest with several barrels of supplies and 1 ox they managed to cut free. 3 teamsters are wounded. 1's dead. The convoy master is shouting orders to close up, to keep moving, because stopping means inviting another attack. And you're shaking, adrenaline flooding your system, realizing how close that arrow came to you instead of the other teamster. Realizing that this will happen again, probably multiple times before you reach your destination. Realizing that your slow, loud, obvious convoy is a target every moment of every day, and all the vigilance in the world only reduces your odds of dying, never eliminates them. You climb back onto your wagon bench. Your hands are trembling. You pick up the goad. You shout at your oxen to move, and they do because oxen don't care about your trauma. They just care about pulling and eating and existing in their simple bovine way. The convoy rolls forward at its agonizing pace, leaving the dead teamster in a roadside ditch because there's no time for burial. There's never enough time for burial. The smell hits you 3 wagons away, something between sewage, rotting meat, and despair. You know immediately what it means. Someone's got the flux, that lovely medieval euphemism for dysentery, and they're experiencing it publicly because privacy doesn't exist when 12 men are crammed into and around supply wagons. The sick teamster is hunched behind his wagon, pale as milk, sweating despite the cool morning air. And from the sounds emerging you know his intestines have declared war on his body, and his body is losing badly. This is your life now. You're not just transporting supplies through hostile territory at speeds that insult snails. You're doing it while sharing close quarters with people whose bodies are actively trying to empty themselves from every orifice, whose open wounds are festering in the heat, whose lungs are producing coughs that spray infectious droplets into the air you breathe. Medieval hygiene on a supply convoy makes modern prison conditions look like luxury spas. You're living in a mobile petri dish, and the diseases growing in it are creative, persistent, and enthusiastically lethal. Let's start with dysentery, because it's the star performer in medieval military medicine's horror show. Dysentery is intestinal inflammation caused by bacteria or parasites that turn your digestive system into a biological weapon aimed at yourself. The symptoms are exactly what you'd expect and worse than you're imagining. Bloody diarrhea, severe cramping, fever, dehydration. You're expelling fluids faster than you can replace them, and in an era before hydration, that's frequently fatal. Medieval armies lost more soldiers to dysentery than to enemy action in many campaigns. It was so common that chroniclers often didn't bother mentioning it specifically, just noting that many died of sickness with the understanding that sickness meant your guts liquefied. The causes are everywhere in your convoy. Contaminated water is the primary vector. You're drinking from streams that have dead animals rotting upstream, or that armies have camped beside and used as latrines, or that local villagers have dumped their waste into because medieval sewage treatment was throw it in the river and hope. The water looks clear enough, tastes fine, and is absolutely crawling with bacteria that your medieval immune system has never encountered. You drink it anyway because the alternative is dying of thirst, which is faster and more certain than maybe dying of dysentery. Food contamination is the second major cause. Remember that rotting pork we discussed? Those spoiling grain sacks? Every meal is a game of microbial roulette. The salted meat has been handled by dozens of hands, none of which have been properly washed. Medieval people washed hands occasionally, with water, no soap, and certainly not with any germ theory awareness. The bread you're eating was made by someone who might have dysentery themselves, kneading their bacteria directly into your meal. Cross-contamination is constant and unavoidable. The symptoms start subtly. Your stomach feels off. You've got some cramping, but you've had cramping before from bad food and it passed. Then the diarrhea starts, and you think it's just a temporary inconvenience, you'll tough it out. But it doesn't stop. It intensifies. You're stopping every hour to squat behind whatever cover you can find. A bush, the wagon itself, often just the side of the road because there's no time for modesty when your intestines are evacuating with volcanic urgency. The other teamsters avoid you, not out of cruelty but out of survival instinct. Everyone knows dysentery spreads, and everyone knows getting it is often a death sentence. The dehydration kills you specifically. Medieval people didn't understand electrolytes or the precise mechanisms, but they understood that people with flux got weaker, then delirious, then died. You're losing water and salts faster than you can replace them. Your skin becomes tented. Pinch it and it stays pinched, losing elasticity. Your eyes sink into your skull. Your mouth is cotton dry no matter how much you drink. Your heart races, trying to maintain blood pressure with insufficient fluid volume. Eventually, your kidneys shut down, your brain swells, and you slip into unconsciousness and death. Treatment is non-existent or actively harmful. Medieval medicine might recommend bleeding you to balance your humors, which removes more fluid you don't have and accelerates your death. They might give you opiates if you're lucky enough for the convoy to carry medical supplies, which help the pain but do nothing for the underlying infection. They might suggest various herbs. Mint for nausea, chamomile for cramps, none of which address the bacterial assault destroying your intestines. Mostly, they isolate you as much as possible, give you water when you can keep it down, and wait to see if you survive. You don't usually. Dysentery on a medieval military campaign had mortality rates around 20 to 40% depending on the strain and the victim's overall health. If you're already weakened by malnutrition, exhaustion, and previous illnesses, which describes every teamster after 2 weeks on the road, your odds are worse. You die within 3 to 7 days of symptoms starting, your body too depleted to continue functioning. You're buried in a shallow roadside grave, unmarked because nobody has time for markers. And the convoy continues without you because it must. Typhus is the other major killer, though medieval people called it camp fever, because it appeared wherever people congregated in unsanitary conditions, armies, prisons, ships. Typhus is spread by body lice, those delightful little parasites that every single person in your convoy is hosting. You've got lice. Your clothes are crawling with them. You feel them constantly, biting, moving, reproducing in the seams of your garments. Scratching provides temporary relief and permanent scarring as you tear your own skin open, creating infection opportunities. Typhus-carrying lice defecate on your skin while feeding, and you scratch the feces into the bite wounds, introducing the bacteria into your bloodstream. Within a week or two, you've got a high fever, crushing headache, and a characteristic rash that starts on your trunk and spreads outward. The fever produces delirium. You hallucinate, lose time, can't distinguish reality from fever dreams. In this state, you're still expected to drive your wagon because manpower is limited and your replacement doesn't exist. You guide your oxen while convinced they're actually demons, or that the road is a river, or that the wagons behind you are enemy soldiers, your fevered brain producing scenarios that would be comical if they weren't tragic. Typhus mortality rates in medieval conditions approached 30 to 50%. If you survive, and many did, you're left weakened for weeks, susceptible to secondary infections, and hosting the bacteria in your system potentially for life. You can relapse during future stress or illness. You're never truly free of it. The only real prevention is not having lice, which requires changing and washing clothes regularly in hot water. Something you absolutely cannot do on a supply convoy where you've worn the same lice-infested tunic for 3 weeks straight. Wound infections are their own special category of horror. Every supply convoy has men with injuries, splinters from the wagon, cuts from cargo handling, blisters that have burst and become open sores, injuries from previous raids or accidents. In modern times, these would be minor inconveniences treated with soap, antibiotics, and bandages. In medieval times, they're potential death sentences. Every wound is an invitation for bacteria, and bacteria accept that invitation enthusiastically. You've got a nasty gash on your forearm from a week ago when a shifting barrel caught you wrong. You tied a strip of cloth around it, the same cloth you've been using to wipe sweat from your face, because dedicated medical supplies are luxuries. The wound isn't healing. It's getting worse. The edges are red and swollen. It's producing a yellowish discharge that smells faintly sweet and rotten. You're developing what medieval people called proud flesh, infected tissue that's swelling beyond the wound margins. The infection is spreading up your arm. You can see red streaks under your skin tracking toward your heart. That's lymphangitis, your lymphatic system trying to fight the infection and losing. If you're extraordinarily lucky, someone in the convoy has basic wound care knowledge, usually whoever served as a soldier and saw plenty of combat injuries. They might heat a knife and burn the infection out, cauterizing the wound with red-hot metal that produces smoke smelling like pork and pain that makes you pass out. This sometimes works, killing enough bacteria to let your immune system catch up. Sometimes it just adds burn trauma to your infection and you die anyway, but more painfully. Historians still argue whether medieval military medical care was completely useless or merely mostly useless, but the evidence suggests that survival rates for significant infections were abysmal. Without antibiotics, your body either fought off the infection itself or didn't. Strong immune systems, good nutrition, and rest might tip the odds in your favor, except you're on a supply convoy, so you've got none of those things. You're malnourished, exhausted, stressed, and surrounded by other sick people. Your immune system is overwhelmed before the fight starts. Gangrene represents the infection's final form, tissue death spreading through your body, turning flesh black and producing a smell that's unmistakable and unforgettable. Gas gangrene, caused by certain bacteria, produces subcutaneous gas that crackles under your skin when pressed. It's fascinating from a pathology standpoint and absolutely horrifying from a this is happening to your body standpoint. The treatment is amputation if it's in a limb and you have access to someone willing to saw your arm or leg off with medieval surgical tools. If it's in your torso, you die. There's no medieval surgery that can save you from abdominal gangrene. The close quarters amplify every disease. You're sleeping next to other teamsters, sharing whatever shelter exists, usually just the space under wagons. You're breathing their exhalations, touching surfaces they've touched, drinking from shared water skins, eating from communal cooking pots. Every respiratory infection spreads like wildfire. Someone develops a cough, could be a cold, could be influenza, could be tuberculosis, no way to know. And within days half the convoy is coughing. Some recover. Some develop pneumonia, fluid filling their lungs, drowning slowly from the inside while they continue working because stopping means abandoning your wagon. Tuberculosis, called consumption, for the way it consumed sufferers from within, was endemic in medieval Europe. It spread through respiratory droplets from infected people coughing, and you're around coughing people constantly. TB is slow but relentless. Over months, it destroys lung tissue, causing persistent coughing, bloody sputum, night sweats, and progressive weakness. On a long military campaign, you can watch someone develop TB, decline slowly, lose weight until they're skeletal, and finally die coughing blood. There's no treatment. Isolation might prevent spread, but isolation isn't an option when you need every available body to keep the convoy moving. One particularly nasty detail that's often glossed over: dental health on medieval military campaigns was spectacularly bad and contributed to serious systemic infections. You're eating hard bread, dried meat, and coarse grains that wear down your teeth. Medieval dental hygiene consisted of maybe rinsing your mouth occasionally.
No tô truches, no tô te paste, no flossing.
Your teeth decay rapidly, producing cavities that progress to abscesses, pockets of infection in your jaw that cause excruciating pain and can spread to your bloodstream or brain. Tooth abscesses killed people regularly. The cure was extraction, which meant having someone, not a dentist, just whoever was willing, pull your infected tooth with pliers or similar tools. No anesthesia, hoping they didn't break your jaw in the process. Scurvy starts appearing on longer campaigns, especially winter ones when fresh food is unavailable. It's caused by vitamin C deficiency, though medieval people didn't know about vitamins. They just knew that after months of eating nothing but grain, salt meat, and ale, people's gums started bleeding, their teeth fell out, old wounds reopened, and they developed skin hemorrhages. Scurvy is insidious. You feel increasingly weak and depressed. Your wounds won't heal. You bruise from the slightest touch. Untreated, it's eventually fatal as your connective tissues literally fall apart. The cure is fresh fruits or vegetables, which you don't have because fresh produce doesn't survive week-long wagon journeys. The psychological toll of constant illness might be worse than the physical diseases themselves. You wake up every morning cataloging your symptoms. Is that cough new? Is my diarrhea getting worse? Does that cut look redder than yesterday? You're hypervigilant about your own body, convinced every minor ache is the start of something fatal, because sometimes it is. You watch people around you sicken and die with depressing regularity, and you know you could be next. There's no medical evacuation, no hospitals, no safety net. If you get seriously ill on this convoy, you die on this convoy, and your body gets left in a ditch so your corpse doesn't slow down the wagons. Sanitation practices, such as they are, barely deserve the name. Latrine discipline is theoretically enforced. You're supposed to dig pits away from water sources and cover them when done, but in practice, exhausted teamsters defecate wherever is convenient. The convoy camps become fecal minefields, especially at night when you can't see where previous occupants have relieved themselves. You step in human waste regularly. It gets on your boots, your clothes, your hands, and from there into your mouth because you're eating with those hands. The fecal-oral route is paved and well-traveled in medieval supply convoys. One quirky historical reality. Medieval people weren't stupid about disease transmission. They recognized that sick people could make others sick, that crowding increased disease, that some illnesses traveled through water or air. They had practical folk knowledge about isolation, about boiling suspicious water, about burning contaminated materials. The problem wasn't ignorance. It was that implementing good practices was often impossible given the constraints they operated under. You know you should isolate the dysentery patient. You can't because you need him driving his wagon until he literally cannot stand. You know the water's questionable. You drink it anyway because the alternative is dehydration, which kills faster than dysentery. The medical supplies you're carrying, and there usually are some buried in the cargo, are rudimentary but better than nothing. Willow bark for pain and fever, which actually works because it contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin. Honey for wound dressing, which has genuine antibacterial properties. Various herbal poultices that range from possibly helpful to definitely not harmful to actively poisonous. Alcohol for cleaning wounds when it's not being drunk instead. Linen for bandages. Maybe opium if the convoy's wealthy enough, which helps with pain and dysentery symptoms even if it doesn't cure anything. But medical supplies run out, get used up, spoil, or are stolen during raids. 3 weeks into your journey, the medicine chest is mostly empty, and you're back to treating injuries with hope and prayer. The prayer probably works better, honestly. At least it can't make things worse, unlike some medieval medical interventions. The cumulative effect of living in disease-saturated conditions for weeks is that everyone's health degrades simultaneously. The convoy that started with 50 healthy Teamsters now has 30 who are functional, 10 who are seriously ill but still working, and 10 who are dead or so incapacitated they've been left behind. The survivors are all carrying multiple infections and parasites, all malnourished, all exhausted. You're held together by necessity and momentum, your body running on fumes, your immune system doing its best with insufficient resources. And still the wagons roll forward because the army needs supplies, and your health is less important than those supplies, and medieval logistics doesn't pause for pandemics or individual suffering. The sick Teamster from this section's opening has finished his public intestinal rebellion and is climbing shakily back onto his wagon bench. His chances of surviving the week are maybe 50-50. But right now, he's got oxen to drive and a convoy to keep up with, so he's driving because that's what you do. You do the job until the job kills you, which it probably will. The rain started 3 hours ago as a light drizzle that seemed almost refreshing after days of dust and heat. You even smiled briefly, thinking how nice it would be to wash some of the filth off your face. That was before the drizzle became a downpour. The downpour became a deluge, and you realized with growing horror that weather in medieval Europe doesn't just make you uncomfortable. It actively tries to murder you and often succeeds. Water is pouring off the canvas wagon cover in sheets, finding every gap, every worn seam, every spot where the fabric's degraded from sun exposure and rough use. It's running down your neck, soaking through your wool tunic. Wool that weighs about 3 times its dry weight when saturated and clings to your skin like a cold, scratchy parasite. Your leather boots, already marginal at waterproofing when new, have given up entirely. Your feet are swimming in water that squishes with every step, and you can feel blisters forming on top of existing blisters. The wet skin sliding against itself in ways that promise future infections. The road, such as it was, has become a river of mud. Not the decorative mud of a garden after light rain. This is deep, sucking, adhesive mud that reaches past your ankles and actively fights every step. Your oxen are struggling, their hooves sinking with each plodding step, the suction making horrible wet sounds as they pull free only to sink again immediately. They're expending triple the energy for half the forward progress, and you can see them tiring in real time, their heads drooping lower, their breath coming harder. The wagon wheels are disappearing into ruts that have become channels, trenches, eventually small canyons carved by running water. The front right wheel drops into a particularly deep rut, and the entire wagon lurches sideways at an angle that makes your heart stop. For a moment, a very long moment, you think it's going over, spilling tons of supplies and probably crushing you in the process. But the wagon settles, groaning ominously, still upright but now trapped in a rut deep enough that the axles nearly dragging on the ground. Forward motion stops. Your oxen are pulling. You can see their muscles straining, their hooves churning mud, but the wagon isn't moving. The wheels are stuck, bogged down, and no amount of animal effort is freeing them. The convoy master is already riding back, his face a portrait of fury poorly masked by wet exhaustion, and you know what's coming. Everyone's going to have to stop, dismount, and push your wagon out while losing precious time and giving raiders an opportunity to attack a stationary target. Medieval weather wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a tactical factor that killed more soldiers than swords in many campaigns. Rain turned roads impassable, swelled rivers into uncrossable barriers, ruined supplies, sickened troops, and generally made every aspect of military logistics exponentially harder. Supply convoys were particularly vulnerable because speed was already your weakness, and bad weather reduced that speed to effectively zero. The pushing begins. 8 teamsters and 4 guards gather at the rear of your wagon, bracing their shoulders against the back panel, their feet searching for purchase in slippery mud. The convoy master counts down, 1, 2, 3, and everyone shoves while you shout at your oxen to pull, and for a moment nothing happens. The wagon doesn't budge. It's held fast by mud and physics and what feels like the universe's personal vendetta against you specifically. Then someone loses their footing, falling face first into the mud, and the whole effort collapses into chaos. The fallen teamster is cursing, trying to stand but slipping repeatedly, eventually crawling away covered head to toe in brown slime. The rest are breathing hard, bent over, looking at the wagon with expressions that suggest they're contemplating just burning it and walking away. The convoy master is shouting something about effort and duty that nobody's listening to because his words are being swallowed by rain that's somehow gotten heavier, which you didn't think was possible. Round 2 involves boards. Someone produces thick planks that are supposed to go under the wheels to provide solid purchase. This requires digging around the wheels to get the boards under them, which means lying in the mud, reaching underneath a multi-ton wagon that could shift and crush you, all while rain pours into your face and mud fills your mouth and nose. You're doing this, it's your wagon, so it's your responsibility, and the indignity is almost worse than the danger. You're literally wallowing in filth to maybe, possibly, move your wagon forward a few feet. The boards go in. Another push. The wagon lurches forward maybe 6 inches. Then the boards shoot out from under the wheels like projectiles, nearly impaling the teamster behind you. Back to square one. Except now everyone's even more exhausted and the mud's deeper because the rain shows no signs of stopping. Medieval Europe's Atlantic climate meant rain could continue for days, even weeks. You're only 3 hours in. This could be your reality for the foreseeable future. Historians still argue whether medieval armies should have simply halted operations during sustained bad weather, but the consensus is that halting meant starvation because supplies still needed to move even when conditions were terrible. So convoys pressed on, making absurdly slow progress, losing men and materials to weather-related accidents, because the alternative was armies running out of food and collapsing without ever fighting a battle. The temperature is dropping as evening approaches, and this is where weather transitions from miserable to lethal. You're soaked to the skin, and wet clothes in falling temperatures create a deadly combination called hypothermia. Medieval people didn't know the term, but they understood that people who got too cold stopped shivering, started acting confused, and then died quietly. Your body is losing heat faster than it can generate it, your core temperature dropping degree by degree toward unconsciousness and death. There's no shelter. The wagon cover keeps rain off the cargo somewhat, but provides no protection for you. You could crawl under the wagon, but the ground under there is just as wet, and lying in cold mud doesn't help. You could try to light a fire, but everything's soaked. Wood, kindling, even the supposedly waterproof tinder is soggy. Some teamsters carry flint and steel, and they're striking frantically, producing sparks that fizzle out in the wetness, achieving nothing except frustration. The nights are worse. The convoy eventually gets your wagon moving again through a combination of extra oxen, planks, brute force, and desperate prayer, but progress for the rest of the day is measured in hundreds of yards, not miles. When darkness falls, and it falls early because the storm clouds block what little sunlight remains, you stop wherever you are because moving blind in these conditions means accidents that kill people and animals. You're spending the night in wet clothes in near-freezing temperatures with no fire and no shelter. Your teeth are chattering so hard you're worried they'll crack. You're huddled against your wagon's wheel, trying to share body heat with other teamsters who are equally desperate. Medieval wool retains some insulating properties even when wet, which is the only reason you're not dead already. But you're not warm. You're never warm. You're just varying degrees of dangerously cold. Sleep is impossible, or you think it is, but then you're jerking awake from dreams you don't remember, realizing you dozed off, which is dangerous because sleeping in hypothermic conditions means you might not wake up. You force yourself to move to keep blood circulating, doing small exercises that your exhausted body protests. Around you, other teamsters are doing the same, or they're not moving at all, which might mean they're sleeping or might mean they're dying, and in the darkness you can't tell the difference. Dawn arrives eventually, gray and wet, the rain continuing with mechanical persistence. You take inventory of the convoy and discover 2 teamsters didn't wake up. Hypothermia claimed them in the night. Their bodies are already stiff, skin blue-white, faces peaceful in that way dead people look when they've died quietly. You're supposed to bury them, but the ground is saturated and digging graves is impossible. So they get a shallow scraping of mud over top and the convoy moves on because it must. Summer rain is different but no less dangerous. Instead of hypothermia, you get heat exhaustion compounded by humidity. You're wearing layers of wool because that's what you own, and the rain soaks them, and the sun comes out between downpours, turning your clothes into a personal sauna. You can't remove the clothes because you need them for the next rain, so you bake inside sodden wool, sweating profusely, losing salt and water you can't easily replace. Heat stroke presents as confusion, cessation of sweating, rapid heartbeat, and eventually collapse. Medieval people called it sun sickness and treated it by moving the victim to shade and pouring water on them, which actually works but requires catching it early. On a moving convoy where everyone's focused on keeping wagons rolling, heat casualties might not be noticed until they fall off their wagon, unconscious or dead, and by then intervention is often too late. The sun itself is an enemy during clear weather. You're outside all day, every day, exposed to UV radiation that medieval people didn't understand but definitely experienced. Sunburn ranges from uncomfortable to debilitating. Severe burns blister, weep, and become infected. Your face, neck, and forearms are constantly burned. The skin peeling in sheets, new sensitive skin underneath burning immediately. Some teamsters wrap their heads in cloth for protection, looking like improvised mummies. Others just endure and develop leather-like skin that's permanently damaged but at least doesn't burn quite as easily. Sun glare off wet roads after rain is blinding, causing headaches and temporary vision problems. You're squinting constantly, developing permanent crow's feet around your eyes from decades of squinting, assuming you survive long enough for decades to matter. Eye problems were common: infections, injuries from flying debris, damage from sun and dust. Going blind in medieval Europe meant becoming a beggar. So you protected your eyes as best you could and hoped luck stayed with you. Winter campaigns were their own special hell. The Byzantine Empire largely avoided winter operations because their commanders understood logistics, but Western European armies sometimes had no choice. Sieges couldn't be abandoned just because snow fell, and supply convoys had to continue even in brutal conditions. You're now driving a wagon through snow that's knee-deep in places, drifted higher in others, completely obscuring the road so you're navigating by memory and prayer. The cold is aggressive and personal. It attacks your extremities first, fingers, toes, nose, ears, reducing blood flow until the tissue literally freezes. Frostbite starts as numbness, which seems like a blessing because at least the pain stops. Then the tissue turns white, then gray, then black as it dies. Frostbitten fingers fall off or have to be amputated. Frostbitten toes rot inside your boots, and you don't discover them until you remove the boots and your toes come off with them. This happened regularly on winter campaigns. Chronicles mention it casually. Many lost limbs to the cold. Your oxen suffer equally. They're not winter animals. They're farm animals adapted to temperate climates who are now expected to pull loads through snow and ice. Their breath comes out in clouds. Ice forms on their muzzles. Their hooves crack in the cold, and if they're not shod properly, they go lame quickly. A lame ox in winter is a dead ox because you can't stop to let it heal, and an injured animal weakens faster in cold conditions. One particularly nasty winter phenomenon: freezing rain that coats everything in ice. The roads become skating rinks. Your wagon slides unpredictably, sometimes sideways, the wheels finding no purchase on ice-covered ground. The oxen slip and fall, their legs splaying out, their weight coming down on joints that weren't meant to bend that way. You hear bones break, a sharp crack that's unmistakable, and then the bellowing starts, and you know you've just lost an ox to a broken leg, which means you're down to 3 animals trying to pull a 4-ox load through winter conditions. Historians still argue whether the Little Ice Age climate shift in the medieval period made military campaigns significantly harder, but the evidence of crop failures, harsh winters, and increased mortality suggests yes, everything was harder when Europe cooled a few degrees. Supply convoys that might have been merely difficult in warmer periods became death marches in the Little Ice Age winters. Food freezes solid, which sounds like good preservation until you realize you can't eat frozen salt pork without thawing it, and thawing requires fire, and fire requires dry fuel, and you have no dry fuel. You're gnawing on frozen bread that's hard enough to break teeth, trying to soften it in your mouth with saliva that's also cold. The ale in your barrels freezes and expands, cracking the barrels, spilling the contents, robbing you of calories and the minimal warmth alcohol provides. Wind is the invisible killer, stealing body heat through exposed skin and clothing. The wind chill effect wasn't understood scientifically, but medieval people knew that windy cold days killed faster than calm cold days. You're traveling through open country with no windbreaks, the wind screaming across fields and hitting your convoy with nothing to slow it. It penetrates every layer, finds every gap in your clothing, and carries away your body heat enthusiastically. You're shivering so hard you can barely hold the ox goad, your muscles burning through calories trying to generate heat, burning through your already inadequate food reserves, pushing you toward the edge where your body simply runs out of fuel. One quirky survival technique: sleeping with your oxen. Animal body heat is substantial, and a huddle of teamsters pressed against resting oxen could survive nights that would kill them if they slept alone. The oxen tolerated this because they probably appreciated the human warmth too, or because they were too tired to care. Either way, you'd wake up covered in ox hair and smelling like ox shit, but you'd wake up, which was the important part. The psychological impact of weather as constant enemy breaks people in ways combat doesn't. You can fight human enemies, swing a weapon, run away, strategize. You can't fight rain or sun or cold. They're implacable, mindless, infinite. They wear you down not through dramatic confrontations, but through relentless, grinding persistence. Day after day of suffering from conditions you cannot change or escape creates a helplessness that crushes morale. Some teamsters simply gave up. They'd sit down beside the road in a rainstorm or snowdrift and refuse to continue. Sometimes their fellows could cajole or threaten them into moving. Sometimes they just sat there until they died, their bodies retrieved later or left behind, depending on whether the convoy master felt charitable. Weather-induced despair killed plenty of people who were physically capable of continuing but mentally unable to endure another day of suffering. The convoy's pace, already glacial, becomes geological in bad weather. Miles per day drop to fractions of miles. A journey planned for 7 days stretches to 3 weeks. Supplies that were calculated to last the trip run out. People starve, freeze, or sicken in numbers that turn the convoy from a military operation into a humanitarian disaster that's somehow still expected to deliver cargo. And through it all, the weather doesn't care. It rains on the just and unjust alike, freezes the guilty and innocent equally, and makes no distinction between vital military supplies and the people dying to transport them. You're soaked, frozen, or baked depending on season. Your skin is damaged, your body hypothermic or heat-stroked, your supplies ruined. The oxen are failing, your fellow teamsters are dropping, and still you continue because orders are orders, and somewhere ahead an army is waiting for these supplies, and your suffering is apparently the price of their survival. The wagon lurches forward another few feet, wheels grinding through mud that will be frozen ruts tomorrow and dust a week from now, continuing this cycle until the weather or the journey finally kills you. Probably the weather. The sound reaches you before you see anything. A low, distant roar like thunder but continuous, overlaid with sharper sounds you can't quite identify. Metal on metal, maybe. Screaming, definitely. Your stomach drops as you realize what that sound means. The battle has started, and you're close enough to hear it, which means you're close enough to be caught in it. The convoy master rides down the line, his face grim, shouting orders that amount to, keep moving and pray. The army you've been crawling toward for 2 weeks is finally engaged with the enemy, somewhere over that rise ahead, and you're arriving at exactly the wrong moment. Not early enough to supply them before the fight, not late enough to avoid the fighting entirely. You're driving a slow, defenseless wagon full of supplies into an active battlefield, and every survival instinct you possess is screaming at you to turn around and flee. But you can't because desertion means execution, and besides, where would you flee to? You're in hostile territory, days from anything resembling safety, and running alone means dying alone. The sound grows louder as your wagon crests the hill. The valley below is chaos made visible. Thousands of men packed into a relatively small space. Formations dissolving into melees, banners falling and rising. The ground already churned to mud and worse. You can see cavalry wheeling on the flanks, archers loosing volleys that look like dark clouds, pike formations locked in shoving matches where the losing side gets pushed back onto its own wounded. The scale is overwhelming. This isn't a raid or a skirmish. This is a real battle, the kind that songs get written about, assuming anyone survives to write them. Your orders are somehow to descend into that nightmare, skirt the fighting, and establish a supply point behind your army's lines. In theory, there are lines, organized positions where your side controls space and the enemy doesn't. In practice, battles are fluid disasters where control is temporary and geographic distinctions are theoretical. That area that looks safe could be overrun in minutes. Those soldiers who look like they're on your side might be enemy troops who've captured your army's equipment. You're navigating by hope and incomplete information, pulling tons of supplies toward violence that could engulf you without warning. The descent begins. The road, barely a suggestion even before the battle, is now completely destroyed by the passage of thousands of troops, horses, and previous supply wagons. It's rutted beyond recognition, littered with discarded equipment, broken weapons, Bodies of men who didn't make it this far. Your wagon bounces over something that might be a person and you don't look back because you can't. You just keep your eyes forward and pray your oxen don't panic from the noise and smell. The smell is unforgettable. Battlefields have a distinctive odor. Blood, obviously copper sharp and nauseating in quantity. Shit, because men void their bowels when they die or when they're terrified or just because dysentery doesn't pause for combat. Sweat and fear, acrid and bitter. Smoke from fires, some accidental, some tactical, all adding a layer of throat-burning haze. And underneath it all, the beginning notes of decomposition because bodies in summer heat start rotting within hours and there are a lot of bodies. You're passing wounded now, men staggering back from the fighting, clutching injuries that range from survivable to horrifically fatal. An archer missing most of his jaw, blood pouring down his chest, his eyes wild with shock. A knight whose armor has been peeled back like a can, exposing the pulped meat underneath. A foot soldier dragging himself with his arms because his legs don't work anymore, leaving a trail of blood. They're calling for help, for water, for their mothers. You have water, but you don't stop because stopping means falling behind, means becoming a target, means risking your cargo. So you don't stop. You look away and keep driving, and their cries fade behind you, and you'll hear those cries in your dreams for the rest of your life, however long that is. The traffic is impossible. You're not the only supply convoy approaching. There are other wagons, pack animals, camp followers, all trying to navigate the same destroyed road toward the same general area. It's gridlock at walking speed, wagons jammed against each other, teamsters shouting, animals braying. Nobody's in charge of traffic control because medieval armies didn't have logistics officers coordinating movements. You're supposed to figure it out yourself, which means aggressive positioning and hoping you don't get stuck in a jam while arrows start falling or cavalry comes through. Arrows are falling, actually. You're not in the main battle, but you're close enough that stray volleys reach you. Medieval arrows don't have GPS. Archers loose them in general directions and hope they hit enemies. Some hit friends instead. Some hit civilians, animals, or wagons full of supplies. You hear the distinctive whistle thud of arrows hitting wood, the sharper sound of one hitting canvas, the wet sound of one hitting flesh. A teamster 3 wagons over goes down with an arrow through his neck, arterial blood spraying in rhythmic pulses, his oxen continuing to plod forward because the oxen don't know their driver just died. Your job is to establish a supply point. Essentially, park your wagons in a designated area where soldiers can access supplies quickly. The designated area is theoretical, marked on a map that bears little resemblance to reality. You're looking for a collection of standards and flags that supposedly mark the logistics zone, but everything's smoke and confusion and nothing looks like it should. You see what might be the right area or might be a trap, or might just be an empty field that seems safer than alternatives. You're parking, maneuvering your wagon into position alongside others, creating a rough square of vehicles that provides some minimal defensive structure. This is when you discover that several of your supply sacks have arrows in them. The grain is leaking, pouring out through punctures, and there's nothing you can do about it right now. More immediate problems. A group of soldiers is running toward your wagons, and you can't tell if they're friendlies seeking supplies or enemies seeking plunder until they're close enough to make intentions clear. They're friendly, thank whatever gods listen, and they're desperate, grabbing food without asking, breaking open barrels, stuffing their mouths with anything edible. You're supposed to control distribution, but you're one exhausted teamster facing dozens of starving soldiers who've been fighting for hours. You let them take what they want and hope someone with authority shows up to establish order. Chaos reigns for hours. Soldiers come and go, some to grab supplies, some to dump wounded in the area because it's relatively protected, some just to collapse from exhaustion. You're now surrounded by injured men in various stages of dying, their moans and screams mixing with the continuing sounds of battle. Medieval battlefield medicine is mostly separate the dying from the survivable and focus on the survivable, which means wounded men are triaged quickly. This one gets bandaged, that one gets water and prayers, these ones over here get ignored because they're beyond help. You're conscripted into helping with the wounded because you're present and have hands. Nobody asks if you have medical training. Nobody has medical training in the modern sense. You're holding down a soldier while someone cuts an arrow out of his shoulder. No anesthesia, just 4 guys pinning him while he screams. You're pouring wine into wounds as antiseptic, which burns like fire and might prevent infection or might do nothing, but it's what they've got. You're helping amputate a crushed leg with a saw designed for wood. Watching a man bite through a leather strap from the pain. Knowing he'll probably die from shock or infection anyway, but they're trying because trying is all they can do. Historians still argue whether medieval battlefield medicine saved significant numbers of lives or was mostly security theater to make soldiers feel cared for, but the survival rates for serious wounds suggest it was marginally better than nothing. Arrows to limbs were survivable if you could stop the bleeding. Gut wounds were almost always fatal. Abdominal surgery didn't exist in any meaningful form. Head wounds varied wildly. Some men survived devastating skull fractures. Others died from seemingly minor injuries. It was random, arbitrary, and you were watching it unfold in real time around your wagon. The battle's momentum shifts. You can tell not from seeing the fighting directly, but from the flow of people and the changing tenor of sounds. Victory sounds different than defeat. There's more shouting and less screaming, more organized movement and less panicked fleeing. Your side seems to be winning, or at least not losing catastrophically, which means your wagons probably won't be captured and you probably won't be killed immediately. Probably. The wounded keep coming. The area around your wagons becomes a field hospital, a supply depot, and a morgue all simultaneously. Bodies are being laid out in rows for later identification and burial. Injured men are packed together, the ones who can sit sitting, the ones who can't lying in whatever position hurts least. There's blood everywhere, soaked into the ground, splattered on wagon sides, coating your hands and clothes. The smell is beyond description, beyond anything you've experienced, and you're dry heaving between tasks because your body can't process this level of sensory assault. Night falls and the fighting continues, though it's more scattered now. Small units hunting each other in the darkness, archers loosing blind volleys, confused melees where friend and foe are indistinguishable. You're supposed to maintain the supply point through the night, which means no sleep, constant vigilance, and managing the flow of soldiers who keep arriving to demand food, water, arrows, replacement weapons. You're beyond exhausted, operating on adrenaline and fear, making decisions about supply distribution that you're completely unqualified to make. Give out too much and you'll run out before the battle's over. Give out too little and soldiers might die from lack of arrows or starve before they can fight effectively. You split the difference and hope it's right. Looting starts after dark, not by enemies but by your own side. Soldiers who decide the official distribution is too slow and they'll help themselves. You're supposed to prevent this, but how? You're one unarmed teamster versus armed men who've spent the day killing and are thoroughly desensitized to violence. They take what they want. You document nothing because there's no documentation system. The quartermaster will eventually discover supplies are missing and blame you, and there's nothing you can say that'll change that. You were responsible for the cargo. The cargo got stolen. Therefore, it's your fault. Medieval logic. The supply line itself is collapsing even as you try to maintain it. Wagons are destroyed, hit by artillery, burned, broken by rough use. Oxen are dead or missing. Some killed by stray missiles, others cut loose by thieves. Some just wandered off during the chaos. Teamsters are casualties, killed, wounded, or fled. The supplies you brought are being consumed faster than anticipated because nobody's calculations accounted for the actual conditions of battle. You're running out of everything simultaneously. Dawn of the second day reveals the aftermath. The fighting's mostly over. One side retreated during the night, leaving the field to the victors. Your side won, apparently, which means you've successfully supplied a winning army, which should feel triumphant but mostly feels empty because you're looking at the cost. Bodies are everywhere, hundreds or thousands depending on the battle's size. The wounded who survived the night are in agony, crying for water, for mercy, for death. The ground is destroyed, churned into bloody mud decorated with broken weapons, discarded armor, severed limbs, and other debris you don't examine too closely. Your job now shifts from supply distribution to salvage and evacuation. The army's moving on, pursuing the defeated enemy, or regrouping, or simply getting away from this field that stinks of death. You need to pack up remaining supplies, load wounded who can be moved, and somehow get your damaged wagon convoy back to civilization. This is when you discover how bad your losses are. Half your wagons are destroyed or abandoned, 3/4 of your oxen are dead or missing, most of your supplies are gone, and the teamsters who survived are in no condition to continue. One quirky historical detail. After battles, soldiers and locals would swarm the field looking for salvage, weapons, armor, valuables from corpses, even the corpses themselves if there was a ransom market. This happened so predictably that armies factored it in. Your victory included rights to loot the dead, your side and theirs. You're watching men strip bodies methodically, removing anything useful or valuable, leaving corpses naked in the mud. It's economically rational in medieval terms. These resources would otherwise be wasted, but it's spiritually crushing to witness. The retreat from the battlefield is chaotic and broken. Your convoy's not a convoy anymore. It's a scattered collection of damaged wagons with improvised crews, carrying wounded men and salvaged supplies, pulled by exhausted animals, moving away from the battle site because staying is death. You've lost track of who's in command. The convoy master is dead or deserted or simply gone. You're following other wagons in what you hope is the right direction, moving slowly through a countryside now hostile because the battle drove refugees and brigands into the territory. You pass through the battlefield itself on your way out. The bodies are already bloating in the sun, flies covering them in living carpets. Scavenger birds are everywhere, crows and ravens and things you can't identify, pulling at exposed flesh. You see a dog worrying something that used to be a person. You see a wounded man who's still alive despite catastrophic injuries, too weak to move but strong enough to suffer. Nobody stops to help him. You don't stop. You can't. Stopping means becoming part of this field permanently. The supplies you didn't deliver because they were stolen or destroyed or consumed will cause problems downstream. Some unit won't have arrows when they need them. Some soldiers will go hungry because the food didn't arrive. The army might lose the next battle because your convoy failed to maintain supply integrity. Or maybe it won't matter. Maybe they'll win anyway or lose for different reasons, and your suffering will have been meaningless noise in the grand chaos of medieval warfare. You delivered some supplies. You survived. Barely. Your wagons destroyed. Your oxen dead. Your fellow teamsters killed or scattered. You're injured, you don't even remember how, something during the chaos, your arm hurts and there's dried blood, but you're alive, so it's minor by battlefield standards. You've experienced the absolute limit of what human beings can endure and remain functional. You've seen things that'll haunt you until you die, which might be tomorrow because you're still in hostile territory with minimal supplies and no clear path home. The battle's over. Your role in it is finished. The army will fight again, and they'll need supplies again, and some other poor bastards will drive wagons towards some other battlefield and experience their own version of this nightmare. But that's their problem. Right now, your only problem is surviving long enough to care about future problems. The wagon lurches forward. Your surviving oxen, just two now, borrowed from abandoned wagons, pull with exhausted determination. Behind you, the battlefield smolders and stinks. Ahead, More days of dangerous travel through hostile country. You're going home, if home still exists, if you can find it, if the journey doesn't kill you first. Here's what the chroniclers will write about the battle you just survived. The army was victorious, routing the enemy with great slaughter. Supplies arrived in timely fashion. That's it. 16 words to summarize weeks of suffering, dozens of deaths, and your complete psychological destruction. The nobleman who commanded the army gets 3 paragraphs about his tactical brilliance. The knight who captured an enemy banner gets 2 sentences. You get nothing. Not your name. Not your sacrifice. Not even acknowledgement that you existed. This is your legacy as a supply wagon driver in medieval Europe. Comprehensive, total, absolute anonymity. You are functionally invisible to history despite being essential to it. Armies cannot function without logistics, but logisticians are not heroes in the medieval worldview, so they're simply omitted from the historical record as if they never existed. You're a ghost in your own time, doing work that everyone depends on and nobody remembers. The chroniclers, mostly monks and clergymen writing for noble patrons, had a specific vision of what mattered in warfare. Knights mattered because they were noble literally and figuratively. Their genealogies, their heraldry, their individual acts of courage filled pages of careful Latin script. Kings and lords mattered because power was the currency of historical significance. Even common soldiers sometimes made it into chronicles if they did something spectacular enough, held a bridge alone, saved a commander's life, died in particularly dramatic fashion. But you hauled grain, you drove oxen, you slept in mud and survived ambushes and watched your fellows die of dysentery. None of that is heroic by medieval standards. There's no glory in not dying from infected wounds, no honor in successfully navigating your wagon through hostile territory, no legendary status awarded for delivering supplies on time despite impossible odds. The things that made your job difficult, whether disease, bandits, mechanical failures, were too mundane for epic poetry. You suffered, but you suffered without witnesses who mattered, and in medieval history, unwitnessed suffering might as well not have happened. The economic records sometimes mention you, account ledgers tracked supplies loaded and delivered, calculating losses with bureaucratic precision. 20 wagons departed, 14 arrived, shortfall attributed to enemy action and spoilage. You're implicit in those numbers, one of the teamsters who somehow got 14 wagons through. But you're not named. You're a line item, an assumed labor cost, part of the logistical overhead that makes warfare possible. The clerks who wrote these records cared about the supplies, not the people moving them. Grain was valuable. You were replaceable. Military manuals from the period, what few exist, treat supply logistics as a solved problem requiring no detailed explanation. Ensure adequate supplies are available appears as an instruction, as if supplies simply manifest through willpower rather than the desperate efforts of people like you. The manuals detail battle formations, siege tactics, and weapon techniques in exhaustive detail, but supply convoy organization gets maybe a paragraph suggesting you should guard them adequately. The writers either didn't understand the actual difficulties involved or didn't think them worth recording. Probably both. Historians still argue whether this documentary silence reflects actual medieval attitudes or just the limitations of who got to write things down. But the result is the same. You don't exist in the primary sources. Scholars studying medieval military history can tell you about every major battle's tactics, participants, and outcomes, but they can't tell you the names of the teamsters who made those battles possible. The sources don't exist. The records weren't kept. Your life was considered too trivial to document. The battlefield you just left will be written about for centuries. Historians will debate the commander's decisions, analyze the troop dispositions, argue about whether the outcome was inevitable or contingent. They'll create detailed maps showing unit movements, complete with little blocks representing formations, arrows indicating charges, dotted lines showing retreats. Your supply convoy won't appear on those maps. The area where you established the logistics point won't be marked. The wounded you helped treat won't be counted in casualty figures because medieval record-keeping focused on nobles and knights, not common soldiers, and definitely not support staff. Some archaeological evidence of your existence might survive, though you'll never know it. Centuries later, people will dig in the areas where convoys traveled and find wool ruts, ox shoes, broken pottery from cooking vessels, maybe remnants of the supplies you transported. They'll carbon date these finds, write papers about medieval logistics, create museum exhibits showing typical supply wagon equipment. But they won't know it was your wagon. They won't know your name. They'll make educated guesses about how these systems functioned, acknowledging that workers whose names are lost to history made it all possible. That's your memorial. Admission that someone must have done this work, identity unknown. Forever. The oral tradition didn't preserve you either. Songs and stories passed through generations focused on battles and heroes, adventures and romances, legendary figures doing impossible things. Nobody composed ballads about teamsters who successfully delivered grain. There's no song of the ox driver celebrating your navigation skills or your ability to survive dysentery. The folk culture that preserved so many medieval stories found nothing in your experience worth preserving, or perhaps found it too depressing to commemorate. Who wants to sing about suffering without glory? Your family, assuming you had one, might remember you for a generation or two. Grandfather drove supply wagons in the wars, might be mentioned occasionally, then forgotten as the people who knew you died and new generations emerged with their own concerns. Without written records, without official recognition, without anything connecting your name to your deeds, you dissolve into generic ancestry. You become some ancestor who fought in the wars, and eventually just a gap in the genealogy. A generation that exists only because the generation after it exists. The religious institutions that controlled much medieval record-keeping had complicated relationships with people like you. If you died during your convoy service, you might get a funeral mass if your body made it to a church, which was unlikely. Most teamsters who died on campaign were buried in roadside graves or left unburied entirely. No marker, no recorded burial location, no prayers entered into the church register. Your soul was commended to God in generic prayers for all the faithful departed, but your individual identity was lost. The church cared about your spiritual welfare in theory but didn't bother documenting your existence in practice. One quirky historical reality. Some medieval wills mention debts owed to or by common workers, including teamsters. I owe 3 shillings to John the Wagoner for services rendered. Appears in testament occasionally. This provides rare glimpses of individuals. A name, an occupation, a transaction. But even these references don't tell us anything about the person beyond their economic relationship to the willmaker. You exist in the document as a financial obligation, not as a human being with experiences worth recording. And these references are rare. Most teamsters never appear in any document at all. The nobles you served remembered you only when convenient. If supplies arrived late, you were blamed by name, temporarily documented as the incompetent who failed his duty. If supplies arrived successfully, credit went to the quartermaster or logistics officer who coordinated the system, not to you who actually moved the goods. Your visibility in the power structure was asymmetric. Visible when failing, invisible when succeeding. This created a documentary record that only captures your failures while omitting your successes. A historical legacy where you appear only as a cautionary example, if you appear at all. The battlefields themselves, those sites where you suffered most acutely, are now tourist attractions in many cases. Modern visitors walk the grounds where thousands died, read interpretive signs explaining the tactical situation, visit museums displaying weapons and armor. They learn about the commanders, the political context, the strategic significance. They don't learn about you. There's no plaque commemorating the supply convoy that made the battle possible. No exhibit showing what your wagon looked like or explaining your working conditions. You've been edited out of the tourist-friendly version of history just as thoroughly as you were edited out of the contemporary accounts. Some modern historians have tried to recover the experiences of common people in medieval warfare, using creative reading of sources, archaeological evidence, and comparative analysis. They've written books with titles like The Hidden Army or Medieval Logistics that attempt to reconstruct what your life was like. These are valuable scholarly works that acknowledge your existence and importance. But even they can't tell your story specifically because the sources don't exist. They can describe the typical experience of a medieval teamster, extrapolate from fragmentary evidence, make educated guesses. They can't say who you were, what you thought, how you felt about your service. You remain anonymous even in works dedicated to recovering anonymous voices. The irony is almost funny. The very supplies you risked your life transporting were recorded meticulously. The grain, the salted meat, the ale, the weapons, all of it was counted, documented, tracked from origin to destination. The materials received more careful record-keeping than the people moving them. A barrel of wine had provenance. You didn't. The cargo was valuable and therefore documented. You were merely labor, replaceable, and therefore ignorable. Medieval society's priorities are laid bare in what they chose to remember and what they chose to forget. Your suffering had no redemptive arc in the medieval Christian framework that shaped these narratives. Martyrs who died for faith were celebrated. Soldiers who died in battle were honored as defenders of Christendom. Nobles who suffered during political struggles were mourned as tragic figures. But you died from dysentery or bandits or exposure, prosaic deaths without spiritual significance. Your suffering didn't serve a clear religious purpose, couldn't be framed as noble sacrifice, offered no lessons about virtue or faith, so it was ignored, considered somehow less real or less important than suffering that fit the approved narrative templates. Historians still argue whether the lack of documentation for common workers represents intentional erasure or just the practical limitations of medieval record-keeping. But the effect is identical regardless of intent. You're gone. Your name is lost. Your experiences are unrecorded. Future generations will never know you existed as an individual. You've been retroactively removed from history, not through conspiracy but through systematic indifference to people of your social class. The armies you supplied went on to fight more wars, using more supplies transported by more anonymous teamsters. The system you were part of continued for centuries, evolving slowly, always dependent on people willing or forced to do thankless, dangerous work for minimal recognition. Medieval warfare was built on your labor and the labor of thousands like you, but you're not in the foundation myths. You're not in the origin stories nations tell about themselves. You're not commemorated on monuments or memorialized in art. You simply aren't, historically speaking. And here's the cruelest part. You probably knew this while you were alive. You knew the knights got songs and you got nothing. You knew nobles had their deeds recorded while yours were ignored. You knew you were essential to the military machine but invisible to the people operating it. You did the work anyway because you had no choice, or because you needed the pay, or because your lord commanded it, or because refusing meant death. You lived and suffered and maybe died knowing that none of it would be remembered, that your contribution to history would be erased as thoroughly as if you'd never existed. Your bones are somewhere, probably, in a roadside grave in France, or a mass burial pit near a battlefield, or scattered in a forest where you died fleeing bandits. Unmarked, unvisited, unknown. The earth has reclaimed them, along with the bones of thousands of other teamsters, guards, servants, and workers who made medieval warfare possible. Someday, maybe someone will dig them up during construction or archaeological survey. They'll be analyzed, carbon dated, possibly displayed in a museum as medieval individual, sex and age determined, occupation unknown. That's the closest you'll get to resurrection. A skeleton in a display case, labeled with clinical precision but without identity. The supply wagons themselves are mostly gone too, rotted away or broken up for parts. They would repurposed, their iron reforged. A few fragments might survive in museum collections, an axle fitting, a piece of yoke, maybe a whole preserved wagon discovered in a bog or extremely dry conditions. These artifacts are precious to historians studying medieval logistics, but they're also silent. They can't tell your story. They're evidence that the system existed, not evidence of the individuals who made it work. The roads you traveled on might still exist in a sense. Modern highways sometimes follow medieval routes that followed Roman roads that followed even older tracks. You might have contributed to wearing those paths a little deeper, your wagon wheels adding their infinitesimal wear to the cumulative erosion of centuries. It's not much of a legacy, but it's something. The land itself remembers the passage of countless travelers, even if it can't distinguish you from anyone else. And so you fade. Your individual identity dissolves into the category medieval common folk. Your specific experiences generalized into what life was like for ordinary people. Your suffering abstracted into statistics about medieval mortality and hardship. You become a data point, an assumption in historical models, a blank space in genealogical records. You exist in history only as an absence, a gap in the record that implies someone must have been there but doesn't tell us who. The wagon you drove, broken now, sits abandoned beside a road in a country you'll never see again. The oxen you cursed and cared for are dead or sold. The cargo you protected is consumed or rotted or lost. The people you traveled with are scattered or dead or moved on to other work. Nothing remains of your months of service except the vague awareness, recorded nowhere, that someone delivered those supplies because supplies don't deliver themselves. You're forgotten, completely, utterly, forever, and thousands like you doing the same work, suffering the same hardships, facing the same dangers, share your obscurity. The medieval world ran on your labor and forgot you the moment you stopped providing it. That's the final indignity of the supply wagon driver. You were essential and invisible, vital and worthless, necessary and forgotten. History moved on without remembering your name. And now, as our journey through this corner of medieval life comes to a close, let yourself settle deeper into comfort. The wagons have stopped their creaking. The oxen have been unyoked, finally allowed to rest. The supply convoys of the past continue their endless journeys through time. But you can step away from them now, back into the safety of your own moment, your own bed, your own peace. The teamsters we've traveled with tonight have returned to the silence of history, their struggles preserved only in imagination, their voices lost but somehow, for a little while, almost heard. They endured what they had to endure. They carried what needed carrying. They disappeared into time's long forgetting, as we all eventually will, but tonight we remembered them, gave them space in our thoughts, acknowledged what they suffered in service of armies and kingdoms and causes that rarely acknowledged them. It's okay to let them rest now. Let the images fade, the mud, the rain, the endless road. Let the sounds diminish, the creaking wheels, the lowing oxen, the distant battle. Feel your own breathing, steady and calm, your own body relaxed and safe, here in this moment that belongs only to you. History's hardships remain in history. You're here now, comfortable and drifting towards sleep. The medieval world, with all its harshness and all its forgotten people, recedes into the gentle darkness behind your closing eyes. The supply wagons continue their ghost journeys through abandoned roads that time has reclaimed, carrying their invisible cargo toward battles that ended centuries ago. and you, released from witnessing, can finally, peacefully let go into sleep. Rest well. The wagons will still be there in the archives, in the fragmentary records, in the archaeological traces, whenever history calls you back. But tonight, they've delivered their final load. A story, a remembrance, a small act of recognition for people history tried to forget.